The story begins in the quiet after the storm. The great empire of Charlemagne had shattered, leaving behind fragments of glory scattered across the heart of Europe. From the ruins of that dream, a new world began to take shape, not in marble palaces or golden halls, but in cold fortresses and the hearts of men who refused to kneel. The land that would become Germany was not yet a nation, but a mosaic, 1,000 small worlds stitched together by blood, faith, and the endless hum of ambition. The Carolingian line had faded, its last heirs powerless to bind the restless duchies and tribes that now ruled themselves. Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, Lorraine, each a realm with its own ruler, its own army, its own God-given pride. To the west, the kings of France dreamed of central power. To the east, Slavic tribes and Magyar riders prowled the frontier. But in the center of the continent, the Germans stood divided, proud, and unyielding, like mountains refusing to bow to the wind. It was in this chaos that one man rose, Otto of Saxony, a duke's son born not of legend, but of purpose. He was no god-king like Charlemagne, but he carried a vision to restore unity, not through conquest alone, but through faith and order. In 936, under the open sky of Aachen, the old capital of Charlemagne, Otto was crowned king of the Germans. The bells rang across the valleys, their echoes rolling through the forests like thunder. It was not the birth of a nation, but of an idea, a Germany that might, one day, stand as one. Yet Otto's throne was forged in struggle. The great dukes, jealous and proud, refused to bow. The young king faced rebellion from within his own bloodline, as his brothers and vassals rose against him. For years, his crown was a weight of iron rather than gold. But Otto was patient, calculating, a ruler who understood that in Germany, loyalty must be earned, not demanded. He married alliances instead of forging chains. He turned bishops into princes, gifting them land and authority to counterbalance the nobility. And in the shadows of abbeys, where monks copied ancient texts by candlelight, Otto wove a new kind of empire, one where the church itself became the spine of royal power. When the Magyars, fierce horsemen from the east, swept across the plains in 955, burning villages and slaughtering priests, it was Otto who stood against them. At Lechfeld, near Augsburg, he rallied his divided lords beneath one banner. The battle was brutal, a storm of steel and faith. Arrows darkened the sky, the ground ran red with blood. But when the dust settled, the Magyars were broken, and Germany stood victorious. That day, the tribes and duchies looked to Otto not just as a king, but as the protector of Christendom itself. 2 decades later, Otto's ambition would reach beyond the Alps. Like Charlemagne before him, he marched into Italy, crowned once more, this time by the Pope himself, as Holy Roman Emperor. The dream of Rome had found a new heir in the north. The crown was heavy, its jewels cold against his brow, but it gleamed with divine promise, Imperator Romanorum. And yet, even in triumph, the seeds of future turmoil were already being sown. Otto's empire was vast, but fragile, a network of loyalties tied by faith and fear, not by law or nationhood. Every duke he rewarded would one day demand independence. Every bishop he raised would one day serve 2 masters, God and Emperor. Otto's successors would inherit his crown, but not always his vision. As his reign waned, whispers grew in the monasteries and markets alike that perhaps Germany could never truly be united, that it was destined to be many rather than one. Still, Otto's shadow loomed long over the centuries that followed. He had given the Germans something they had never truly possessed before, an identity. Not a single nation, but a shared spirit, a spark that would burn, quietly and stubbornly, through the chaos to come. The torches of his empire burned bright for now. But beyond the mountains and rivers, darkness stirred once more. The eternal struggle between power and piety, between the sword and the cross. And soon, a new dynasty would rise to claim Otto's legacy, one that would take the dream of empire to even greater heights. and to the edge of ruin. In the centuries that followed Otto's reign, Germany did not rest. It smoldered. The crown passed from hand to hand, from dynasty to dynasty, each emperor chasing the same impossible ghost: unity. Yet Germany was not like France or England, where kings ruled by birthright and blood. Here, emperors were chosen, elected by princes, crowned by the church, and bound by the fragile thread of respect rather than obedience. The Holy Roman Empire was not one kingdom, but a storm of 100 voices trying to sing the same song. And from within that chaos, a family rose whose name would echo through every valley and fortress of medieval Europe: the Hohenstaufen. They came from the rugged lands of Swabia, a region of dense forests and stone castles where men spoke little and fought hard. In 1138, Conrad III, the first of their line, was chosen as king of the Romans. He was strong but cautious, a man walking on a tightrope of alliances and betrayal. His reign was marked not by conquest, but by endurance, for Germany, by then, was already fracturing under the weight of its own freedom. The princes ruled like small kings, and the bishops guarded their lands as jealously as any noble. Yet Conrad's blood carried a spark that would soon ignite into legend. That spark was his nephew, Frederick Barbarossa. Tall, broad, with hair the color of fire and a gaze that could silence courts, he was born not just to rule, but to be remembered. The chroniclers wrote that when he rode into a city, the crowds fell silent, not from fear, but from awe. To his followers, he was the rebirth of Rome itself. To his enemies, the storm that would drown them all. When he took the crown in 1155, the empire seemed to breathe again. The bells of Aachen rang as they once had for Otto, and messengers carried his name to every corner of Europe: Frederick Barbarossa, Emperor of the Romans. But Barbarossa's empire was a dream constantly tested by reality. In Italy, the northern cities, Milan, Venice, Florence, had grown rich and proud, defying imperial authority. They were republics of merchants, bound not by crowns, but by gold. To Frederick, this defiance was an insult carved into the heart of his inheritance. He rode south, leading his knights across the Alps like an iron tide. The banners of the empire fluttered above endless columns of soldiers, armor gleaming beneath the sun, their breath rising in mist as they crossed the snowbound passes. Italy trembled. Barbarossa's armies laid siege to rebellious cities, one after another. Milan, proud and defiant, fell beneath his wrath, its walls torn down, its people scattered. Yet for every city he crushed, another rose in defiance. The Lombard League, a coalition of Italian communes, united against him. In the fields of Legnano in 1176, his dream of domination met the stubborn will of free men. The battle raged from dawn until dusk, the air filled with dust, cries, and the clang of steel. When the sun set, Barbarossa's banners lay broken among the dead. It was not defeat that destroyed him, but realization. The emperor who sought to bend Italy to his will had learned that even the mightiest crown cannot silence the hunger for freedom. In the years that followed, he made peace with his enemies and turned his eyes once more to the north, to Germany, to the heart of his realm. There, the empire flourished under his rule. Cathedrals rose like mountains of stone, their spires reaching for heaven. Trade thrived along the rivers, the Rhine, the Danube, the Elbe, arteries of life pulsing through the empire's body. Frederick's final journey would take him far from home, to the burning sands of the East. Answering the call of the Third Crusade, he marched toward the Holy Land at the head of a vast army. But fate is cruel to even the greatest of men. In 1190, while crossing a river in Asia Minor, the emperor who had once commanded continents drowned in its cold waters. The current carried away his body, but his legend only grew. In Germany, they whispered that Barbarossa never truly died, that he sleeps beneath the mountain of Kyffhauser, his red beard growing through the stone, waiting for the day he will return to restore the empire's glory. His story became not just history, but prophecy, the eternal dream of unity that would haunt Germany for centuries to come. And as the fires of his age faded, new powers stirred. The emperors who followed would inherit his crown, but not his fire. Yet in the shadows of abbeys and merchant halls, in the ringing of hammers and the prayers of peasants, the Holy Roman Empire continued to breathe, vast, divided, eternal. When the echoes of Barbarossa's death finally faded, the empire he had built did not crumble, it changed. Germany entered a new kind of power, one not forged on battlefields, but in workshops and marketplaces, in the ringing of bells and the whisper of quills on parchment. The world was awakening to trade, to craft, to faith that reached for the heavens in stone and glass. It was the age of cities and cathedrals, when wealth no longer came only from the sword, but from the skill of hands and the courage of minds. The German lands were not a single nation, but a vast constellation of free cities, each glowing like a star against the dark medieval sky. Lübeck, Nuremberg, Cologne, Augsburg, Hamburg, proud, bustling, alive. They were ruled not by dukes or bishops, but by guilds and councils of merchants who measured power in silver and ships instead of armies. In narrow streets lined with timbered houses, the air was thick with the smell of bread, iron, and ink. Bells tolled from tall church towers, calling the faithful and marking the rhythm of the city's heart. From the cold ports of the Baltic to the winding markets of the Rhine, the Hanseatic League was born, a brotherhood of cities bound by trade and protection. Their merchants sailed in fleets of tall ships, their holds filled with furs from Novgorod, salt from Lüneburg, grain from the plains, and cloth from Flanders. They spoke different dialects but shared one language, profit. With the League's rise, German cities became the lifeblood of Northern Europe, their silver coins crossing borders faster than any army could march. In the shadow of this prosperity, another kind of monument rose, not to kings, but to God. The Gothic cathedrals of Germany became the empire's soul made visible. Cologne Cathedral, begun in 1248, was not merely a church. It was a mountain of stone that defied time itself. Its twin spires seemed to pierce the heavens, and its stained glass windows glowed like jewels when the sun touched them. In every arch and vault, in every carved saint and gargoyle, lay centuries of devotion and artistry. The people who built them would never see them finished, yet they worked as though each stone brought them closer to eternity. But for all its beauty, this was still an age of tension, of invisible wars between the crown, the church, and the people. The emperors, weakened by internal divisions, struggled to assert authority. The papacy, powerful and cunning, sought to pull the empire's strings from Rome. The merchants wanted freedom to rule their cities. The nobles wanted to keep their lands. And in between them all, the peasants, countless, voiceless, burdened, toiled in fields owned by others. Still, this chaos bred brilliance. The universities of Heidelberg and Erfurt began to shape new generations of thinkers. Monks copied ancient texts, preserving the wisdom of Greece and Rome. Minstrels and poets traveled from court to court, weaving stories of love, honor, and betrayal. The air of medieval Germany was thick with contradictions, poverty beside opulence, superstition beside scholarship, faith beside doubt. And in the distance, beyond the glittering cathedrals and bustling ports, something darker stirred, the slow, inevitable shifting of power. For centuries, the emperors had tried to bind their lands with oaths and crowns, but the balance was tilting. The merchants' ledgers and the bishops' decrees had become more powerful than any royal command. The Holy Roman Empire was not falling, it was transforming. By the late 13th century, the name of the empire still shone with ancient dignity, but its throne had grown cold. The title of emperor was now a prize of politics, not destiny, traded between noble houses, contested by popes, and hollowed by compromise. Yet among the people, in the taverns and the towers, the dream of Germany persisted, not as an empire of iron, but as a land of craft, of spirit, of endless creation. By the late 13th century, the name of the empire still shone with ancient dignity, but its throne had grown cold. The title of emperor was now a prize of politics, not destiny, traded between noble houses, contested by popes, and hollowed by compromise. Yet among the people, in the taverns and the towers, the dream of Germany persisted, not as an empire of iron, but as a land of craft, of spirit, of endless creation. It was a strange kind of peace, one where swords slept beneath altars and power hid behind parchment. But peace, in the medieval world, never lasted long. As the cathedrals reached higher, the shadows beneath them deepened. Across the empire's vast lands, whispers began to spread of rebellion, of heresy, of voices that dared to question both emperor and pope. The age of trade and faith was about to give birth to something new, something dangerous. The world of knights and bishops was fading, and in its place, a restless dawn approached. Soon, Germany would face not just the struggle for unity, but the struggle for its very soul. By the dawn of the 14th century, the Holy Roman Empire stood vast but uneasy, a realm of towering cathedrals and restless hearts. The people prayed, but their prayers had grown heavier, laced with doubt. For centuries, the Church had promised salvation in exchange for obedience, but the streets of cities and the fields of peasants told a different story. Gold flowed into Rome while hunger ruled the villages. Bishops wore silks while farmers starved. And beneath the sermons and incense, the question began to echo, what if the truth did not belong only to the Church? That question was dangerous. It began as a whisper in monasteries, then spread to towns and villages. Men and women who read the scriptures in their own tongue, who questioned indulgences, who spoke of God without permission, they became heretics in the eyes of Rome. In the empire's winding valleys and stone-walled towns, faith began to divide. Some followed preachers who called for purity and poverty, like the Waldensians of the Alps, who believed that the Church had strayed too far from Christ's simplicity. Others turned to mysticism, claiming that one could find God not in cathedrals, but within the soul itself. The Church, alarmed, answered with fire. The Inquisition came north. Cloaked priests and papal envoys rode into cities like Cologne and Mainz, bearing the seal of Rome and the authority to root out heresy wherever it hid. Trials were held in candlelit halls where accused men stood trembling before robed judges. Some recanted, some resisted, others simply disappeared. In the marketplaces, wooden stakes were raised, and the smell of burning flesh mingled with the scent of incense. Yet even as fear spread, so did fascination. The very act of silencing voices made people listen more closely. The free spirit movement began to emerge. Mystics and visionaries who claimed to experience divine union without priests or sacraments. Among them were women, Beguines, who lived together in spiritual sisterhood outside convent walls, tending to the sick and the poor while preaching quiet rebellion against the hierarchy. To the Church, they were dangerous, not because they were evil, but because they were free. In the imperial courts, emperors and princes watched these fires with unease. Faith was not just belief, it was politics, the glue that held the empire together. Every heretic burned was a warning, but also a sign that control was slipping. The emperors, once crowned by popes, began to resent Rome's hand on their crowns. The struggle between the cross and the crown, between church and empire, deepened into something darker, something personal. When Emperor Frederick II had ruled a century earlier, he had challenged papal authority so fiercely that the Pope called him the Antichrist. Now, that spirit of defiance lingered in the air. Princes began to side with reformers, if not from conviction, then from the desire to claim more independence from Rome. The Church's grip on the empire was strong, but the cracks were widening. And while theology divided scholars, the people clung to miracles. Pilgrims traveled to sacred relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, vials said to hold the Virgin's tears. In a world of plague, famine, and endless war, they sought comfort in the divine, even when the divine seemed to have turned its face away. The Black Death loomed on the horizon, though no one yet knew it. The air itself seemed heavy with omen. By torchlight, Inquisitors still hunted whispers in the dark, but faith could no longer be contained by fear. In the silent corners of monasteries, in the songs of wandering preachers, in the hearts of peasants and nobles alike, something ancient was stirring, the hunger for truth unchained. The empire still glittered on the surface, its cathedrals unbroken, its merchants thriving, its nobles feasting, but beneath that grandeur, the foundations trembled. The Holy Roman Empire had survived war, ambition, and time itself, but the fire that now spread was different. It was not a war of steel, but of words, of belief, of awakening. And soon, those sparks would ignite a storm that even emperors could not command, a storm that would tear faith, power, and history apart. It began quietly, as all great disasters do. A sickness whispered from the east, carried by the wind, by ships, by fate itself. No one knew where it came from, only that it followed the routes of trade. The same veins that had once pumped life and wealth through Europe now pulsed with death. By the year 1347, the Black Death had reached the empire's borders. Within months, it was everywhere. At first, the people prayed. When the first bodies were carried through the streets, wrapped in linen, the priests swung censers heavy with incense, their voices trembling with psalms. But the prayers did not stop the dying. The air turned foul with decay, and the bells rang without rest. In every city, Cologne, Nuremberg, Lübeck, Prague, carts rolled through narrow streets piled with corpses. Families locked themselves inside their homes. Windows shuttered, doors sealed, silence broken only by coughing and the creak of wooden wheels. No one understood the plague. To some, it was God's punishment for the sins of mankind. To others, it was witchcraft or the work of demons. Desperation turned to madness. Flagellants, men dressed in rags, marched from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in hopes of divine mercy. They sang hymns that echoed through the night, their cries mingling with the howling wind. In the countryside, mobs rose in violence, searching for someone to blame. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned the wells, and entire communities were wiped out in acts of terror and fear. The empire's strength was built on people, and now, its people were dying faster than they could bury their dead. Fields went untilled, trade stopped, cathedrals stood half-finished, their scaffolds empty. The Hanseatic League ships rotted in their harbors, sails torn by wind and time. Even the monasteries, once places of refuge, became tombs. Monks fell one by one, their prayers fading into silence. But even in this darkness, strange lights flickered. In the emptiness left by death, the survivors began to see the world differently. The plague did not just destroy bodies, it shattered faith in the old order. The priests who had claimed to hold God's power had died just like the poor. The nobles who ruled by divine right could not save their families. The illusion of certainty, of a world governed by faith, hierarchy, and law, crumbled. And out of the ashes, a new spirit began to grow, one that questioned everything. If God could allow such suffering, perhaps the church was not his only voice. If man could die so easily, perhaps life itself should be lived differently. This quiet shift would take generations to bloom, but its roots began here, in the shadow of pestilence. In Germany, whole towns vanished. Some villages were left so empty that forests reclaimed them, erasing their names from history. Wolves prowled the roads where merchants once traveled. The empire itself seemed to dissolve, not through war or rebellion, but through silence. Yet the German people, stubborn and unyielding as the stones of their cathedrals, endured. When the plague finally receded, they emerged into a changed world. Fields were green again, markets reopened, and the living buried the past beneath new beginnings. But the survivors were not the same. They carried a wound that time could not heal, a deep, unspoken knowledge of mortality and fragility. In the years that followed, art and faith began to twist together into new forms. Painters filled their canvases with images of death and salvation. Poets wrote of judgment and mercy. The great danse macabre, the dance of death, appeared on the walls of churches, showing emperors and peasants alike led hand in hand by skeletons. The message was clear: all men are equal beneath the scythe. The Holy Roman Empire survived the plague, but it was no longer whole. The old balance of power had shifted again. Nobles, weakened by loss, sold lands to merchants. Cities became freer, their councils stronger. The church, scarred by its failure, faced quiet rebellion from within. And far to the south, in the monasteries of Italy, scholars began to rediscover the lost wisdom of Greece and Rome, a rebirth of thought that would soon sweep across Europe like a second dawn. For Germany, the plague had ended the Middle Ages of certainty. What came next would be an age of questions, of art, ambition, and revolution. The bells that once tolled for the dead would ring again, this time to awaken the living. When the plague's shadow finally lifted, it left behind a Europe forever changed. Across the Holy Roman Empire, life began to stir once more, cautious, uncertain, but unyielding. Town squares that had once been silent now filled with the cries of traders and the rhythm of carpenters' tools. Bells that had tolled for the dying now rang for weddings and festivals. Out of despair, a strange kind of hope began to take root, not born of divine promise, but of human resilience. The people of medieval Germany had survived the unthinkable. In the quiet that followed, they began to rebuild their world not as it had been, but as it could be. Villages grew into towns, towns grew into cities. The merchants of the Hanseatic League reopened their trade routes across the North and Baltic seas, weaving a web of wealth that stretched from London to Novgorod. Ships once again filled the harbors of Lübeck and Hamburg, their sails gleaming in the wind, bearing furs, salt, and grain. The empire was no longer an empire of conquest. It had become an empire of commerce. And with trade came knowledge. Letters and books traveled with goods, carrying new ideas that had begun to stir in the South. The rebirth of ancient wisdom from Italy, where men spoke once more of Aristotle, of geometry, of the beauty of human thought. Slowly, these ideas reached the northern lands, carried by monks, merchants, and wandering scholars. In the universities of Heidelberg, Erfurt, and Leipzig, the seeds of a new curiosity were planted. Learning was no longer just the domain of priests. It became the pursuit of those who sought to understand the world through reason as well as faith. Art, too, began to awaken. In the workshops of Nuremberg and Augsburg, craftsmen turned from simple religious carvings to works of startling realism, faces full of emotion, bodies rendered with lifelike grace. Painters began to experiment with color and light, inspired by stories from Italy, but grounded in the northern love. For detail, they painted not only saints and martyrs, but also merchants, scholars, and the world around them. The faces of the living, not just the blessed dead. Cathedrals continued to rise, but now their walls were decorated not just with divine glory, but with the pulse of everyday life. Glassmakers filled windows with vivid blues and reds, depicting not only angels but farmers and craftsmen beneath heaven's watchful eye. The divine and the human were no longer opposites. They were reflections of each other. In this rebirth, Germany's cities became hives of innovation. Guilds flourished, protecting trades and nurturing apprentices who would one day surpass their masters. Markets overflowed with goods from across Europe, silks from the south, spices from the east, wool from England. The smell of baked bread and burning pitch mixed with the murmur of dozens of dialects. The Holy Roman Empire was no longer merely a political structure. It was a living organism, a patchwork of cultures and ambitions beating in unison. And yet, beneath this blossoming of life, the old questions still lingered. The church remained powerful, but not unquestioned. The memory of the plague and the corruption of clergy had left deep scars. Men and women began to wonder, if God had given humanity the power to reason, why should they not use it to seek truth for themselves? It was in this climate of curiosity that whispers of a new age began to form. Across Europe, astronomers turned their eyes to the stars, questioning the heavens themselves. Alchemists searched for the secrets of transformation, not just of metal into gold, but of ignorance into knowledge. In monasteries and city halls, men spoke of progress, invention, and change. And deep within the empire, in the quiet city of Mainz, a man named Johannes Gutenberg was working on something that would soon set fire to the entire medieval world, not with swords, but with words. The age of trade had revived the body of the empire. The age of printing would awaken its mind. The Holy Roman Empire, born of iron and faith, was about to become the birthplace of ideas. The medieval world was ending, not in fire or famine, but in ink, and the written word would prove more powerful than any crown or creed. In the heart of the German city of Mainz, sometime around the middle of the 15th century, an inventor toiled in near secrecy. His name was Johannes Gutenberg, and though his neighbors thought him nothing more than a metalworker and dreamer, he was quietly constructing a device that would forever alter the course of human history. What he built was not a weapon of war, but a weapon of thought, the printing press. Before Gutenberg, the written word belonged only to the few. Books were copied by hand in monasteries, each letter painstakingly inked on a parchment by weary monks. A single Bible could take years to complete. Knowledge moved slowly, chained to the pace of the scribe's quill. But Gutenberg dreamed of something different, of a world where ideas could travel as fast as rumor, where truth could not be silenced by scarcity. He combined three simple things: movable metal type, oil-based ink, and a wine press, and turned them into something divine. For the first time in history, a page could be reproduced again and again with perfect precision. The machine groaned, the type clacked, and the paper pressed beneath iron and sweat. In 1455, the first copies of his Gutenberg Bible emerged, pages filled with beauty, faith, and perfection. Each one was identical, a miracle of craftsmanship and vision. When word spread, it was as if lightning had struck the medieval world. Scholars, priests, and merchants alike realized what it meant. Books could now be made not by the dozens, but by the hundreds, and soon by the thousands. The gatekeepers of knowledge trembled. The church had always guarded learning within its walls, controlling what could be read and what could not. But now, that control began to slip like sand through its fingers. The empire's cities, Mainz, Nuremberg, Cologne, and later, Leipzig, became the beating heart of this revolution. Printing houses sprang up like wildfire, filling their presses with everything from holy texts to scientific treatises, from sermons to poetry. The scent of ink replaced the smell of incense as the new language of faith and reason spread. And with every book printed, the balance of power shifted a little more. The sons of merchants who once counted coins now read Latin and philosophy. The children of craftsmen could study scripture themselves. For the first time, truth was not handed down. It could be sought, questioned, and debated. The church tried to keep pace. Papal decrees were printed and distributed widely. Indulgences sold more efficiently than ever before, but so too were pamphlets that criticized them. Ideas, once trapped in the libraries of abbeys, now escaped into the hands of the people. A silent revolution had begun, one that would move faster and strike deeper than any sword. In the streets of German towns, you could hear the new rhythm of history, the steady clatter of presses, the rustle of pages, the murmurs of readers gathered by candlelight. Printers became as important as priests. Books became relics of a new kind of faith, not in God alone, but in the mind of man. Gutenberg himself would die poor, his invention seized by creditors. He never lived to see the full power of what he had unleashed. Yet his creation outlived kings and empires. Within a generation, the printed word had transformed Germany into the intellectual heart of Europe. Knowledge that had once belonged to the few now flowed to the many. And those many began to ask questions, bold, dangerous questions. What if salvation could not be bought? What if priests could err? What if truth was not hidden in Latin, but written in the language of the people? The answers to those questions would soon ignite the greatest upheaval Europe had ever seen, a storm of faith and fire that would tear Christendom apart. The presses of Mainz had opened the gates of thought, and what poured through them could never be contained again. The year was 1517, and autumn had settled over the cobbled streets of Wittenberg. The air was cool, crisp, and still, except for one man. a monk with eyes that burned like torches beneath his hood. His name was Martin Luther, and what he carried in his hands would soon ignite a revolution that would tear Europe apart, not with swords or fire, but with words. For years, Luther had watched the corruption of the church grow like rot beneath gold leaf. Bishops sold indulgences, promising forgiveness in exchange for silver. The poor, desperate for salvation, gave what little they had, believing the coin would shorten their suffering in purgatory. Rome glittered with their money. Cathedrals rose higher, the Pope's coffers overflowed, while the faithful starved both in body and in spirit. Luther could no longer bear it. So he did something small, so small that none could have guessed its weight in history. On October 31st, 1517, he nailed a parchment to the door of the castle church of Wittenberg. It held 95 theses, each one a challenge, a question, a spark. He did not curse the church, he called for truth. But truth is dangerous when power depends on lies. Within weeks, his words, printed by the same presses that Gutenberg had birthed, spread across Germany like wildfire. From Leipzig to Nuremberg, from Mainz to Augsburg, people whispered Luther's name. Priests debated him, peasants quoted him, and scholars cheered him. The church had built its empire on fear, and now fear began to falter. Luther's central message was simple yet earth-shattering. Salvation is through faith alone. No pope, no indulgence, no coin could buy the grace of God. The Bible, he said, belonged to everyone, not hidden in Latin but spoken in the tongue of every man and woman. And when he translated the scriptures into German, it was as if he had unlocked heaven itself. For the first time, the people could read the word of God with their own eyes and see how far their priests had strayed. The Vatican thundered back. Luther was summoned, accused, and threatened with excommunication. They told him to recant, to take back his words, to bow before the Pope. But before the Diet of Worms in 1521, standing before emperors and bishops, Luther refused. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with conviction. "Here I stand," he declared. "I can do no other." Those words echoed through the centuries like a bell of defiance. The medieval world, built on obedience and faith in authority, began to fracture. Princes saw opportunity in his rebellion. Towns declared for or against him. And ordinary people, who had never questioned their place in God's design, began to wonder if they too had the right to think, to choose, to believe. Soon, war followed faith. The peasants' revolt erupted. Men and women who had been bound by feudal chains now demanded freedom in both body and soul. Luther, horrified by the chaos, tried to stop it, but it was too late. The fire he had lit no longer belonged to him. The Holy Roman Empire found itself torn from within. Catholic and Protestant, emperor and elector, faith and reason, tearing at each other across a landscape soaked with both prayer and blood. Yet even in the smoke of war, something new was being born, a modern world that questioned instead of obeyed. The printing press that had spread the word now spread rebellion. The church could burn books, but it could not burn ideas. Luther had shattered the silence of centuries. The medieval order, that careful web of church and crown, had been pierced by a monk with a hammer and a dream. And from that fracture, Germany would never be the same again. The world that had once knelt before a single church was now divided by belief, loyalty, and blood. In the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, neighbor turned against neighbor, prince against prince, and brother against brother, all in the name of God. The Reformation, once a war of words, had become a war of fire. It began quietly enough. Luther's message had spread across Germany like wind through dry grass, igniting hearts and minds. But for every soul that embraced the new faith, there was another who clung to the old. The Catholic Church, wounded and enraged, declared the Protestants heretics. The Emperor, Charles V, sworn to defend the unity of Christendom, prepared to crush the rebellion by force. The empire, already fractured by centuries of feudal rivalries, began to splinter further. Powerful German princes saw opportunity in Luther's defiance. By siding with the Reformation, they could defy Rome's authority and weaken the emperor's hand. In Saxony, Hesse, and beyond, rulers declared themselves defenders of the true faith. They confiscated church lands, filled their coffers, and built armies not in the name of peace, but of righteousness. Soon, the empire's skies darkened with the smoke of burning towns. Monasteries were sacked, altars destroyed, icons smashed by those who believed they were cleansing the faith of false idols. Across Germany, the sound of hymns mixed with the cries of the dying. The Reformation had unleashed a fury that no one could control. Charles V, torn between politics and piety, waged war in the name of unity. His imperial banners marched through German soil, bearing the double-headed eagle and the cross of Rome. Yet the more he fought, the more his realm slipped through his fingers. For the princes of the north stood together beneath a new banner, one not of empire, but of belief. This alliance became known as the Hanseatic League, a confederation of Protestant rulers who swore to protect their right to worship freely. They were not merely rebelling against the Pope, they were defying the very idea of absolute authority. And as their forces clashed with the emperors, the heart of Germany burned. Battles raged through Saxony, Thuringia, and Bavaria. Fields once green with harvest were trampled by armies singing psalms instead of war songs. Priests were dragged from pulpits. Churches were stripped bare. It was not just a war for land. It was a war for the soul of Europe. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 was meant to end it. After decades of bloodshed, exhaustion forced compromise. The treaty's words were simple but revolutionary. Cuius regio, ius religio. The ruler of the land determines its religion. It was an uneasy peace, one that did not heal wounds but merely covered them with parchment. For the first time, the Holy Roman Empire was officially divided. Catholic and Protestant states coexisted uneasily, each watching the other with suspicion and fear. The emperor's dream of a united Christendom was shattered. The Church's unbroken chain of authority lay in ruins. And Germany, scarred, divided, and restless, entered a new age of fragile peace built on deep mistrust. But in that division, something remarkable began to grow. The free cities, once caught between church and empire, became centers of culture, science, and art. The printing presses worked tirelessly, spreading new philosophies and discoveries. Scholars debated the stars, physicians dissected the body, and alchemists whispered of transforming metal into gold. Germany had survived the fires of faith, but the ashes still smoldered. The peace would not last, for beneath the surface, ambition and fear continued to boil. Princes plotted, empires shifted, and Europe held its breath. And when the flames returned, they would consume everything. The year is 1600, and the Holy Roman Empire stands like an ancient cathedral, magnificent, but hollowed by time. The golden age of faith has passed, leaving behind suspicion, rivalry, and greed disguised as piety. Though peace reigns on paper, the air in every court and chapel hums with quiet dread. Germany is divided not just by religion, but by ambition, 1,000 little kingdoms dreaming of power. The Peace of Augsburg, once hailed as salvation, had planted the seeds of future chaos. Its law, Cuius regio, ius religio, gave rulers the right to dictate faith, but what of their subjects who believed differently? In cities across the empire, families prayed under their breath, hiding Bibles behind false walls, crossing themselves in secret. Converts were forced, heretics hunted, and small revolts flared like embers across the land. The Church tried to reclaim lost ground through the Counter-Reformation. Jesuit priests returned to German soil, preaching fervently, converting nobles, rebuilding monasteries. The Catholic South, Bavaria, Austria, and Bohemia, gleamed once again with gold and incense. But the Protestant North, led by proud princes and free cities, refused to kneel. The empire had become a chessboard of faith, each move watched by Rome, Madrid, and Vienna. And above them all, in the shimmering halls of power, the Habsburgs plotted. The emperor, Ferdinand II, devout and iron-willed, believed it was his divine mission to restore Catholic unity to the empire. To his mind, The Reformation was not a reawakening of faith, but a disease to be purged. Yet his enemies saw something else, a tyrant cloaked in holiness, a man who would use the cross to claim the crown. Meanwhile, across the forests and rivers of the German lands, the people whispered of unrest. In Bohemia, where Protestants lived under a Catholic king, the tension snapped. On a warm May morning in 1618, in the city of Prague, a group of Protestant nobles stormed the royal castle. They confronted the emperor's governors, accused them of tyranny, and, in one violent act that would echo through the ages, hurled them out the window. The bodies fell 50 feet into the moat below. Miraculously, they survived. The Catholics called it divine intervention. The Protestants called it luck. History would call it the defenestration of Prague, the spark that lit the inferno of the 30 Years' War. At first, few understood what had begun. The revolt in Bohemia seemed small, another of the empire's countless feuds. But the empire was a house soaked in oil, and this spark found every drop. Within months, alliances formed, armies marched, and Europe itself began to divide. The Protestant Union, led by princes from the north and west, declared resistance against imperial oppression. The Catholic League, commanded by Bavaria's Duke Maximilian, rallied in the emperor's defense. France, Spain, Sweden, and Denmark watched with eager eyes, each waiting for their moment to strike. The drums of war began to beat once more across Germany's valleys and plains. Soldiers, mercenaries, and zealots filled the roads, bearing banners of saints and reformers alike. The empire, already fragile, now trembled beneath the weight of ideology and ambition. But this war would not be like the ones before. It would not be a matter of armies alone. It would devour cities, ruin fields, and leave scars that would never fade. The Holy Roman Empire was about to become a battlefield for all of Europe, where faith was the excuse and power the true prize. The defenestration had opened the gates of hell, and soon, all of Christendom would march through them. The year was 1618, and across the cobbled streets of Prague, smoke rose into the sky. The rebellion that had begun with 2 men hurled from a window had turned into open defiance against the might of the Holy Roman Emperor. In taverns and marketplaces, people whispered that Bohemia would stand against the empire, that at last, the Protestants had drawn a line in the sand. At the heart of this revolt stood Frederick V, Elector Palatine, a young prince of the Protestant Union, idealistic and brave, but dangerously naive. The rebels in Bohemia, desperate for a symbol of hope, offered him their crown. Against the advice of wiser men, Frederick accepted. On a cold November morning in 1619, he was crowned King of Bohemia, his wife Elizabeth, daughter of England's King James, standing proudly beside him. To his followers, it was a triumph. To Emperor Ferdinand II, it was treason. The die was cast. Ferdinand moved with the cold precision of a man who believed he carried out God's will. He summoned his Catholic allies, calling upon the League led by the powerful Duke Maximilian of Bavaria, and upon the military genius of his general, Johann Tserclaes, Count of Tilly. The imperial army gathered like thunderclouds on the horizon. The first great battle of the war came swiftly, the Battle of White Mountain, just outside Prague, in November 1620. The Protestant army, made up of farmers, students, and mercenaries, waited behind hastily built defenses. They were brave but disorganized, untested against the emperor's veteran troops. As dawn broke, the Catholic army advanced through the mist, banners raised high, drums pounding like a heartbeat of fate. The clash was brutal but brief. The Protestants were crushed in a single morning. Frederick fled into exile, earning the cruel nickname the Winter King, for his reign had lasted only one season. Prague fell, its churches reclaimed for the Catholic faith, and the rebellion that had dared to challenge the emperor was snuffed out. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The emperor's vengeance was merciless. In Prague's Old Town Square, 27 leaders of the revolt were executed, their heads displayed as a warning to all who would resist imperial power. The message was clear: defiance would be punished, rebellion drowned in blood. Yet even as the gallows creaked, the flames refused to die. Across the empire, Protestant princes watched in horror and anger. They saw not justice, but tyranny. They saw an emperor determined to crush their faith beneath the weight of his crown. And so, while Bohemia fell silent, the rest of Germany began to stir. The war spread like a curse. Saxony, Brandenburg, and Hesse prepared for war. Foreign powers, Denmark, Sweden, and France, watched from the shadows, waiting to turn chaos into opportunity. The Holy Roman Empire was no longer just divided, it was unraveling. And in the heart of this chaos, new men rose from obscurity to fame and infamy. Albrecht von Wallenstein, a mysterious Bohemian noble, began to gather his own army, not of loyalty, but of profit. He offered his sword to the emperor, promising to fight not for faith, but for reward. With his cunning and ambition, he would soon become one of the most feared generals in Europe. As the fires spread from Bohemia into the heartlands of Germany, villages burned, crops withered, and thousands fled their homes. The peasants who once prayed for peace now prayed only for survival. Armies marched, looted, and starved the very land they claimed to defend. The 30 Years' War had begun, and it would consume generations. The Holy Roman Empire, once a tapestry of faith and culture, was now a battlefield soaked in mud and blood. And the worst was yet to come. The early 1620s were a time when Germany ceased to be a land of princes and became a marketplace of armies. The ideals that had once driven men, faith, loyalty, divine purpose, had been swallowed by the chaos of war. Now, soldiers fought not for God or glory, but for whoever could pay their wage. The Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II had triumphed in Bohemia, but victory came with a price. His armies, though powerful, were stretched thin. The empire was vast, and rebellions flared in every corner. To sustain his war, Ferdinand needed not just soldiers, but someone who could command them and fund them without draining the imperial treasury. That man was Albrecht von Wallenstein, a Bohemian noble stripped of his lands after the Protestant revolt. Wallenstein had rebuilt his fortune through sheer ruthlessness. He bought estates from the dead, invested in mines, lent money to princes, and became one of the richest men in the empire. But wealth alone could not satisfy him. Wallenstein wanted power, real, absolute power. He came to Ferdinand with an offer that no emperor could refuse. Wallenstein would raise and maintain an army of 50,000 men at his own expense. In return, he demanded freedom to command as he saw fit, his own laws, his own justice, his own war. Ferdinand, desperate and intrigued, agreed. And so, a new kind of general was born, one who served the emperor, but obeyed only himself. Wallenstein's army was not like others. It was a monstrous force, a swarm of soldiers, mercenaries, adventurers, and criminals drawn from across Europe. They fought for plunder and survival. When there was no enemy to fight, they turned their fury upon the land itself. Villages were pillaged, farms stripped bare, churches looted. Entire regions vanished beneath the shadow of starvation and disease. And yet, on the battlefield, Wallenstein was unmatched. His genius was cold, methodical, and terrifying. He studied the enemy like a chess player, predicting every move. His armies moved with discipline, built fortresses overnight, and fought with the precision of a machine. Under his command, the emperor's banners began to rise once again. Opposing him was another legend of the age, Count Johann Tsercles of Tilly, commander of the Catholic League. Where Wallenstein was calculating and ambitious, Tilly was devout and relentless. His soldiers called him the monk in armor, a man who prayed before every battle and slaughtered without hesitation afterward. For him, the war was holy, every victory a blow against heresy, every massacre a message from God. In 1626, Tilly crushed the Protestant armies at Lutter and Barenberg, annihilating their forces and securing Catholic dominance in northern Germany. Cities burned in his wake, their people put to the sword or driven into exile. His victories filled the emperor's coffers and silenced rebellion for a time. But Wallenstein's rise troubled many. He was no longer a mere general. He was becoming a prince in all but name. His soldiers obeyed him, not the emperor. His wealth grew beyond measure. Even allies began to whisper, had Ferdinand created a monster? By 1628, Wallenstein's power stretched from the Baltic to the Danube. He seized the port of Wismar, built fleets on the Baltic Sea, and spoke openly of creating his own empire within the empire. The princes of Germany feared him, the emperor mistrusted him, and yet none could control him. Meanwhile, across the sea, the Protestant kingdoms of Denmark and Sweden watched with alarm. The emperor's victories threatened not just Germany, but all of Northern Europe. Soon, they would act, and their intervention would transform a German war into a continental catastrophe. For now, Wallenstein and Tilly stood as the twin giants of destruction, their armies scarring the land they claimed to protect. Between them, Germany became a wasteland, its towns reduced to ash, its rivers choked with corpses, its people starving in silence. The 30 Years' War was no longer about faith. It had become something far darker, a struggle for survival in a world that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of mercy. By the late 1620s, the Holy Roman Empire groaned under the weight of its own fury. Towns lay in ruins, the countryside starved, and yet the drums of war did not cease. What had begun as a rebellion in Bohemia had now consumed half of Germany. The emperor, Ferdinand II, seemed unstoppable. His generals, Tilly and Wallenstein, had crushed every Protestant army that dared to rise against them. But across the Baltic Sea, a new player stirred. The King of Denmark, Christian IV, was no mere observer. He was both a ruler and a prince of the Holy Roman Empire, with lands in Holstein that gave him a stake in the war. Proud, ambitious, and devoutly Protestant, Christian saw himself as the defender of the faith, and perhaps as the man who could restore balance to Europe. In 1625, he marched his armies into northern Germany, declaring war on the emperor. The Protestant cause rejoiced. Cities from Bremen to Magdeburg cheered his advance. For a moment, it seemed the tide might turn. But hope in this war was a fragile thing, and soon it would drown beneath the iron heel of Wallenstein and Tilly. Tilly struck first, moving with holy vengeance. His soldiers cut through Danish forces with brutal precision, their prayers echoing through smoke and gunfire. At Lutter and Barenberg, in 1626, Christian's army was annihilated, crushed beneath the discipline and faith of the Catholic League. The fields ran red, and Denmark's dream of salvation died in the mud. Still, Wallenstein was not content to let victory rest. His hunger for power drove him onward, northward, toward the cold waters of the Baltic. His armies swept through Mecklenburg, besieged Lübeck, and pushed deep into Danish lands. By 1629, Christian IV was forced to sue for peace, signing the Treaty of Lübeck, a humiliating end that stripped Denmark of influence and left Germany at the mercy of the emperor. Now, for the first time, it seemed that Ferdinand II might truly forge a united Catholic empire. The Reformation's fire appeared extinguished. The Protestants were scattered, their princes defeated, their faith silenced by cannon and fear. Across the empire, Jesuits rebuilt churches and reimposed the old religion. The emperor's edict, the Edict of Restitution of 1629, ordered all church lands seized since 1552 returned to Rome's control. It was a declaration not of peace, but of domination. The edict enraged the Protestant world. To them, it was proof that Ferdinand sought not reconciliation, but eradication. In the quiet halls of Stockholm, another king listened, a man whose name would soon thunder across Europe like a god of war, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. Gustavus was unlike the kings of his age. Young, fearless, and brilliant, he had transformed Sweden from a northern backwater into a disciplined, modern power. His soldiers were not ragged mercenaries, but trained professionals, armed with new tactics, new weapons, and unshakable faith. He called his war a crusade of light against darkness, and his men believed him. When Gustavus landed on the shores of Pomerania in 1630, the war changed forever. The Swedish army moved like a storm, fast, disciplined, and merciless. They fought not for plunder, but for purpose. Towns that had cowered before imperial forces now opened their gates to him. His arrival reignited the Protestant cause and gave the broken empire new hope. But the emperor would not yield. Tilly, the old warrior, prepared to meet the Swedes in battle. And somewhere in the shadows, Wallenstein watched, his loyalty to the emperor as uncertain as the shifting winds of war. The stage was set for a new chapter, a clash of kings and faiths, fought not just for God or gold, but for the soul of Europe itself. The Swedish storm had arrived, and the thunder of its coming would echo across centuries. The summer of 1630 was unlike any Germany had seen before. Along the gray coast of Pomerania, ships appeared on the horizon, not traders, not invaders, but a fleet carrying destiny itself. At their head stood Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, called by friend and foe alike the Lion of the North. His arrival was more than a campaign. It was a resurrection of hope. For years, the empire had bled. Cities once golden now lay in ashes, and the people prayed for deliverance. They whispered of a savior, a warrior of faith who would rise to challenge the emperor's wrath. And when Gustavus stepped ashore, clad in plain armor, his gaze cold and clear beneath a northern sky, many believed that prayer had been answered. But Gustavus did not come merely to save. He came to change the very nature of war. His army was unlike the lumbering hosts of Wallenstein or Tilly. It moved with speed, precision, and purpose. Soldiers drilled in formations that flowed like water, musketeers and pikemen fighting as one. The Swedish cannon, lighter and faster than any in Europe, thundered across the fields of Germany like divine judgment. The emperor laughed when he heard the Swede had landed. To him, this northern king was nothing but another zealot, a fool chasing glory in a land cursed by endless war. But soon, even Ferdinand's laughter would die beneath the smoke of battle. In 1631, the Swedish army marched south, and the world would remember what followed. The first great clash came at Breitenfeld, near Leipzig, a battle that would decide the fate of Europe. The imperial general Tilly, old and proud, awaited Gustavus with 35,000 men. His veterans had crushed Danes and rebels alike. They feared no man born of woman. Yet what they faced that day was something new. As dawn broke, the sky was pale with mist, and the sound of drums rolled like thunder across the Saxon plain. Gustavus rode before his troops, his voice calm, his presence magnetic. "In God we trust," he said, "and by his grace we shall stand." Then the Swedes moved, not in chaos, but with perfect rhythm. The imperial guns roared, the earth shook, and smoke swallowed the field. But the Swedish lines held. They shifted, adapted, and struck like lightning where the enemy was weakest. Tilly's formations, rigid, ancient, magnificent, crumbled under the weight of innovation. When the smoke cleared, 7,000 imperial soldiers lay dead. Tilly himself barely escaped with his life. Germany rejoiced. For the first time in a decade, the emperor's power was broken. Cities once silent under Catholic rule opened their gates to Gustavus and hailed him as liberator. The Swede pressed onward, through Franconia, through the Rhineland, even toward Bavaria itself. Each step carried not just soldiers, but faith reborn. In 1632, Tilly tried once more to halt him, this time near the river Lech. The battle raged for hours, until a cannonball tore through the old general's body. He died soon after, whispering prayers for his emperor. The man who had once crushed Denmark now lay cold, while Gustavus, the northern lion, roared triumphantly through southern Germany. But power is a treacherous gift. Each victory drew him deeper into the empire's heart and closer to its darkest shadow, Wallenstein. The emperor, desperate and fearful, recalled his enigmatic general. Once dismissed for arrogance, Wallenstein returned with a promise. He would destroy the Swede or die trying. The two titans now moved toward each other through a land of ruin and smoke, their armies vast, their fates entwined. The German people watched in silence, caught between gods and monsters. In their wake, cities burned, churches fell, and the dream of peace seemed as distant as heaven itself. By autumn of 1632, the two armies met at Lutzen, under a gray sky heavy with snow and smoke. It was here that destiny would claim one of them. The dawn of November 16th, 1632, came shrouded in fog so thick that it seemed the heavens themselves wished to hide what was about to unfold. The fields near the small Saxon town of Lutzen lay silent beneath a cold gray sky, but the earth trembled with the weight of armies. On one side stood Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, his armor gleaming faintly in the mist. On the other, Albrecht von Wallenstein, the Emperor's shadow, cold, calculating, and silent as a specter. The air was heavy with anticipation. For months, both men had hunted each other across the broken heart of Germany. Wallenstein, ever the strategist, had avoided open battle, content to let hunger and winter weaken the Swedes. But Gustavus could not wait. His men were freezing, his allies restless. He needed victory, not only to keep his army alive, but to keep the Protestant cause burning. And so, against the judgment of caution, he gave the order to march. As dawn broke, the sound of drums rose through the mist, low, steady, relentless. Soldiers prayed quietly, their breath turning to frost. The smell of powder clung to the air. From a nearby chapel, a chaplain's voice echoed, "God be with us." And then the cannons began. The fog swallowed the battlefield whole. Muskets flared like ghosts in the gray. Men shouted, vanished, and reappeared in clouds of smoke and mud. The wind howled through the chaos as iron tore through flesh and bone. The Swedish guns fired in rhythm, their thunder rolling like a heartbeat through the storm. Gustavus rode at the front, as he always did, a king who led not from behind, but from the very mouth of danger. His horse reared, its mane slick with sweat, as bullets tore the air around him. "Forward, my brothers," he cried. "God is with us today." The soldiers followed, their king's courage lighting the way through the storm. But fate is cruel to even the bravest. As Gustavus charged through the fog to rally a faltering flank, his guards lost sight of him. Somewhere in the smoke, imperial cavalry appeared, dark shapes emerging from the mist like phantoms. A pistol flashed, a musket fired, and the Lion of the North fell. For a moment, the battle froze. No one knew. The Swedes fought on, blind to the tragedy that had just struck their soul. When the truth spread, when the word "the king is dead" tore through the lines, despair threatened to break them. But then something strange happened. The soldiers did not flee. They roared. Fury and grief fused into fire. Under the command of Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar, the Swedish lines surged forward once more. All day they fought, from dawn to dusk, until the fog turned crimson and the sky wept ash. When the guns finally fell silent, the field of Lutzen was a wasteland. Thousands lay dead, Swedes, Imperials, peasants, horses, their bodies strewn like offerings to the gods of war. Wallenstein, wounded and shaken, retreated under the cover of night. The Swedes held the field. It was victory, but hollow, empty, soaked in sorrow. At dawn, the soldiers found their king's body, stripped of armor, lying cold in the mud. His face was peaceful, his sword still at his side. They wept openly, men hardened by years of blood reduced to silence and tears. The Lion of the North had fallen, but his roar still echoed through the hearts of every man who had fought beside him, through the cities he had liberated, and through the faith he had reignited. Across Europe, bells tolled in mourning. Even his enemies bowed their heads in respect. Wallenstein himself, upon hearing the news, is said to have whispered, "He was the greatest of us all." Yet the war did not end. Without Gustavus, Sweden's armies continued to fight, no longer for a king, but for his memory. And Wallenstein, haunted by his own ambition, began to drift away from the emperor he had once served so faithfully. The world had lost its brightest warrior, but darker games were yet to come. Germany bled on, trapped between ghosts and crowns. And from the shadows of Lutzen, a whisper spread that the war was no longer about faith or freedom, but about who would inherit the ashes of the empire. The fog that swallowed Gustavus Adolphus at Lutzen did not lift from Germany. It lingered, heavy, suffocating, and endless, as if the land itself refused to breathe. The Swedish king was gone, but his shadow still haunted the empire. And in that gray stillness, one man began to weave his own fate, a fate born of ambition, pride, and madness. His name was Albrecht von Wallenstein. Wallenstein had always been a paradox, a general who served an emperor yet trusted no one, a noble who cared more for power than for God. He had built his own army, his own empire within the empire, and ruled it like a sovereign prince. Soldiers worshipped him, nobles feared him, and Ferdinand too, the Holy Roman Emperor himself, needed him. For without Wallenstein, there was no army to fight the war. But power breeds suspicion. After Lutzen, whispers began to stir in Vienna's marble halls. He grows too strong, the courtiers murmured. He speaks to kings in his own name. He believes himself above the crown. The emperor, already haunted by defeat, began to doubt the man who had once been his sword. And Wallenstein? He felt the doubt, tasted it like poison on his tongue. His heart turned colder. He had fought for the emperor, crushed rebellions, bled the land dry. And yet, now he was distrusted, dismissed, and insulted. Pride, once his armor, now became his curse. By 1633, the war was changing again. Sweden's armies, though leaderless, still pressed on under generals who carried Gustavus's flame. France, ever watchful, began to meddle more openly, funding Protestant causes to weaken the empire. The continent was unraveling, and in the middle stood Wallenstein, brilliant, ruthless, and untethered. He began to act on his own. He negotiated secretly with the enemy, promising peace if the emperor would make him king of Bohemia. He sent envoys to France, to Sweden, to Saxony, always speaking in riddles, always keeping his true intent hidden. Some said he sought to end the war. Others whispered he meant to replace the emperor himself. His army followed him still, bound not by loyalty to Vienna, but to Wallenstein's gold and charisma. He paid them well, fed them, clothed them, and they loved him for it. But in their loyalty, the seeds of treason grew. When word reached Ferdinand that his general was conspiring with the enemy, the decision came swift and silent. The emperor, who once owed his throne to Wallenstein's victories, now signed his death warrant. In February 1634, the trap closed. Wallenstein, unaware of how far his empire had crumbled, retreated to the small town of Eger in Bohemia. He was weary, sick, and paranoid, his sleep haunted by dreams of betrayal. Around him gathered a handful of loyal officers, or so he believed. But loyalty in war is a fragile thing. Gold buys it, fear keeps it. When both fade, treachery comes. On the night of February 25th, a cold wind howled through Eger's streets. Inside a dimly lit castle chamber, Wallenstein dined in silence. His guards stood watch, their eyes hollow. The sound of boots echoed down the corridor. Then, a door burst open. A group of Irish and Scottish officers, acting on the emperor's secret command, entered the room. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Wallenstein rose slowly, his face pale but calm. "Are you come to murder me?" he asked. They said nothing. A blade flashed. The great general fell without a word. Thus ended Albrecht von Wallenstein, the man who could have been king, the man who believed himself greater than the empire he served. His death sent shockwaves through Europe. Some called it justice. Others called it tragedy. In the camps and villages of Germany, soldiers whispered his name in awe and fear. For even dead, Wallenstein's presence lingered, a ghost of ambition, a warning to all who sought to command fate itself. And yet, the war marched on. His death did not bring peace. The armies still moved, the cannons still roared, and the land that had birthed emperors and dreamers sank deeper into despair. For now, the war belonged not to kings or generals, but to chaos itself, an endless hunger devouring all. The death of Wallenstein should have brought relief to Emperor Ferdinand too. His most dangerous servant was gone, his authority avenged, and his throne, at least in appearance, secure. Yet when the candlelight faded from the room in Eger where Wallenstein's blood had soaked the floor, a silence settled over the empire that felt less like victory and more like a curse. For the first time, Ferdinand faced the truth. The Holy Roman Empire was breaking apart from within. The crown still glittered, but the metal beneath had corroded. His decrees carried across Europe like whispers in a storm, heard by all, obeyed by none. Princes now ruled their lands as kings in all but name. Armies, Swedish, French, imperial, mercenary, roamed freely, each claiming to fight for faith or justice, yet serving only hunger and gold. Germany had become a patchwork of ruin. Whole provinces vanished into ash. Towns once famed for their cathedrals and marketplaces stood silent, their windows blackened, their streets choked with weeds. The people no longer prayed for victory. They prayed only to wake another day. In Bavaria, fields lay barren. In Saxony, wolves prowled through villages abandoned to plague and famine. Children starved, soldiers deserted, and faith itself began to rot. Monks fled their monasteries, priests turned to thievery, and peasants buried their dead by the light of burning churches. The emperor, secluded in Vienna, sent edicts and emissaries, but they carried no weight. His gold could no longer buy loyalty. His armies were ghosts. Even his allies in Spain grew weary of sending aid to a land that seemed cursed by heaven. The papacy, once the firm pillar behind his throne, began to doubt whether God truly favored the Habsburg cause. And still the war spread. The Swedes, burning with vengeance for their fallen king, struck deeper into the south. France, long an enemy of Protestantism, yet terrified of Habsburg power, now entered the conflict openly, not for faith, but for ambition. Cardinal Richelieu, the red-clad architect of France's destiny, whispered to King Louis XIII that the balance of Europe must be broken before the empire devoured them all. In 1635, France declared war on Spain and the empire. What had begun as a holy struggle between Catholics and Protestants now dissolved entirely into a war of nations, crowns, and greed. The map of Europe became a chessboard soaked in blood. From the Rhine to the Elbe, fires burned day and night. French banners met imperial eagles in the same fields where peasants once harvested grain. Swedish cannons shattered the silence of the Alps. The emperor's loyalists fought not for faith but survival, and mercenaries switched sides like reeds in the wind. In those years, the empire lost more to starvation than to swords. Travelers wrote of villages where no cry of a child could be heard, of roads lined with corpses, of rivers running thick with the remnants of war. The land that had once built cathedrals of stone and faith now built only pyres. Ferdinand aged quickly. His beard turned white, his eyes hollow. He prayed daily, believing that endurance was righteousness, that God would restore order if only he held firm. But the divine hand he waited for never came. The Holy Roman Empire, so vast, so ancient, had become a ghost of itself, its crown tarnished, its heart hollow. The emperor ruled over ruins. And yet, amid the despair, whispers began to spread once more of peace. Some said the princes were finally ready to talk. Others scoffed. Too much had been lost, too many debts unpaid, too many graves dug. But even the cruelest wars must one day end. The question was not when, but what would remain when the final flame went out. By 1636, the 30 Years' War had become something less than human. The soldiers who still fought no longer remembered why. Their banners were faded, their oaths hollow, their prayers unheard. The cause of God, the honor of kings. These were words for generals and princes. For the men in the mud, war had become a trade, and death, their only wage. The Holy Roman Empire was a carcass slowly being devoured by those who once called it home. The emperor's decrees were parchment in the wind. His borders existed only in memory. What remained of Germany was an open graveyard, its fields stripped bare, its rivers choked with corpses and wreckage. The war, now in its third decade, consumed not just land, but time itself. An entire generation had grown up knowing nothing but the drumbeat of armies and the smoke of burning towns. France now stood as the great power behind the storm. Cardinal Richelieu, though never setting foot on a battlefield, orchestrated every move like a grand conductor of chaos. He funded Swedish armies, bribed German princes, and unleashed French troops into the Rhineland, claiming to defend liberty while carving out France's future empire. His soldiers fought beside Protestants, against Catholics, proof that ambition had long eclipsed faith. On the other side, the emperor, now Ferdinand III, for the old emperor had died worn and weary, tried desperately to salvage what remained. He called councils, summoned envoys, and prayed that the endless war might finally end in his lifetime. But peace was as elusive as a ghost. Each side demanded justice for its dead, lands for its loyalty, gold for its pain. The war's toll could no longer be measured in victories. It was measured in emptiness. Chronicles tell of cities where grass grew through the cobblestones, of towns where wolves slept in church pews. In Würzburg, a traveler wrote, "Not a single bell rings. The living envy the dead." Yet, amid the desolation, something began to change. Even the most ruthless commanders began to tire of endless campaigns. Generals who once fought for glory now fought for rations. Nobles who dreamed of crowns now dreamed of peace. In the burnt villages, peasants began to whisper a dangerous hope that perhaps the fighting was finally burning itself out. In 1643, Richelieu died. His heart, hardened by power and vision, gave out before the war he had shaped did. His successor, Cardinal Mazarin, inherited not just France's victories, but its exhaustion. Across Europe, kings and ministers began to send cautious letters, speaking of negotiations, of accords, of a new order. It was as if, at last, the continent had remembered it was mortal. Two cities, Münster and Osnabrück, in Westphalia, were chosen as neutral ground. There, diplomats, priests, and princes would gather to attempt what seemed impossible, to end a war that had devoured an entire generation. But even peace required bargaining, and every bargain demanded blood. The Swedes wanted land and gold. The French wanted security and borders. The German princes wanted freedom from the emperor's hand. And the emperor, what he wanted, he no longer had the strength to demand. While negotiations dragged on, the war still sputtered. Battles flared like dying embers, violent, brief, meaningless. In the fields near Nordlingen and Jankow, armies clashed out of habit, not conviction. The smoke rose, the cannons fired, but even victory felt like defeat. By 1646, it was clear that the empire itself could not survive another year of war. The peasants refused to fight. The treasuries were empty. Even mercenaries deserted, vanishing into the forests with stolen silver and broken dreams. And so, at last, words began to matter more than swords. In Westphalia, under candlelight and the wary eyes of envoys, centuries of conflict began to untangle. Voices trembled as they spoke of rights, of faith, of sovereignty. For the first time, Europe tried to imagine peace not as conquest, but as coexistence. Outside, the autumn wind swept through ruined towns and silent fields, carrying away the last echoes of battle. The land waited, scarred, weary, but still alive. Soon, the war that had begun with the spark of rebellion in Bohemia would end with the stroke of a quill. But what would that peace mean for Germany, a land shattered, humbled, and haunted by the ghosts of its own glory? In the autumn of 1648, after 30 endless years of blood and ruin, the war that had devoured Germany finally exhaled its last breath. The bells that had long been silent began to ring once more, not for victory, but for peace. The sound rolled across the shattered empire like the first breeze after a storm, hesitant and fragile, carrying both relief and disbelief. For most, it was hard to remember a time before war. Children born at its beginning were now old enough to bear arms. Those who had once fought for faith now limped home broken, not knowing what they had fought for at all. But in the twin cities of Münster and Osnabrück, far from the ruined fields, history was being rewritten by ink, not iron. The Peace of Westphalia was not one treaty, but many, carefully woven agreements signed by dozens of envoys representing kings, princes, bishops, and republics. It was less a celebration than an autopsy, the dissection of a war that had consumed a continent. The diplomats argued for years about borders, about faith, about the very idea of sovereignty. But at last, after rivers of blood and oceans of words, they reached a fragile understanding. The first decree was simple but revolutionary. No ruler would again impose his faith upon his subjects by force. The madness that had begun with religious zeal would end with religious tolerance. Catholic, Lutheran, and Calvinist princes were to coexist, each sovereign in his own land. The fires of heresy and crusade were to be extinguished, at least for now. The second decree reshaped the very bones of the empire. The Holy Roman Emperor would remain, but his crown would be hollow. The German princes, free at last from imperial overreach, gained near total independence. They could raise armies, make alliances, even wage war, so long as they did not challenge the fragile peace. The dream of a united Christendom under one emperor was dead. In its place stood a Europe of nations, wary and divided, yet bound by the necessity of survival. To the west, France emerged triumphant, claiming new territories along the Rhine and cementing its power as the heart of continental politics. To the north, Sweden secured its place as a great power, rewarded with ports and prestige. And at the center, Germany itself lay in ruins, a graveyard stitched together by parchment. For every clause signed, 1,000 lives had been spent. Historians would later say that 1/3 of Germany's population perished during the war. Villages vanished from maps, languages disappeared, and generations were erased. The peace did not rebuild those lives. It merely stopped the bleeding. Yet even in the ashes, something new began to stir. The Peace of Westphalia, for all its imperfections, marked the birth of the modern world. It gave birth to the concept of state sovereignty, to diplomacy as a shield against destruction, to the idea that nations could coexist without submission. It was a fragile miracle, born from horror. In the months after the treaties were signed, soldiers laid down their weapons for the first time in a generation. Cannons were silenced, banners folded, and mercenaries, men who had known nothing but war, wandered aimlessly through the countryside, unsure of what peace even meant. The land was quiet again, but the silence was heavy. In ruined churches, priests rebuilt their altars. In burned-out cities, merchants returned, sweeping ash from their thresholds. Children played in streets once echoing with gunfire. Slowly, painfully, Germany began to breathe again. But the empire that emerged from the Peace of Westphalia was not the same one that had entered the war. Its unity was gone, its glory dimmed, its spirit fractured. It was no longer the Holy Roman Empire of emperors and crusades. It was something new, uncertain, and vulnerable. The war had ended, but the shadow it cast would stretch for centuries. As the last candles burned in the council chambers of Munster, one envoy, weary beyond measure, was said to have whispered, "This peace is not born of joy, but of exhaustion. And yet, perhaps that is enough." And so, the world turned a page. From the ruins of faith and empire rose a new Europe, one that had learned, through unthinkable suffering, that even power must one day kneel before the need for peace. The bells continued to toll, fading into the mist over fields where wildflowers now grew from forgotten graves. The 30 Years' War was over, but its ghosts would never truly rest. When the war ended, Germany was no longer the land it once had been. It was a broken body, its veins dry, its heart still trembling from the echo of cannon fire. From the forests of Bohemia to the valleys of the Rhine, the land bore scars that no peace treaty could erase. Entire villages had vanished, swallowed by the earth and memory alike. Where there had been laughter, there was silence. Where there had been cathedrals and marketplaces, only bones and blackened stone remained. Those who survived moved like ghosts among the ruins. Farmers returned to fields that had become wilderness, the soil rich not with grain, but with the ashes of the dead. Wolves, long driven from the valleys, crept once more through empty roads. Hunger lingered like a curse. People stripped bark from trees, boiled weeds, and scavenged among old battlefields where rusting weapons glinted like tombstones. Yet even amidst ruin, the will to rebuild stirred. Humanity's most fragile strength, its refusal to give up, emerged once again. In the cities that still stood, Nuremberg, Augsburg, Lübeck, merchants swept the dust from their stalls and began to trade again. In shattered churches, priests gathered the faithful and prayed among the ruins. The bells of old cathedrals, cracked and weary, began to ring once more, not for war, nor for empire, but simply to remind the living that they were still here. The Holy Roman Empire that survived was but a shell of what it once claimed to be. The emperor, now more symbol than sovereign, could no longer command the loyalty of a unified realm. Each prince, duke, and bishop ruled his land as if it were an independent kingdom. Borders blurred, laws overlapped, and 1,000 tiny courts began to hum with new authority. What had once been a dream of unity became a mosaic of divided power, 1,000 suns rising and setting within the same empire. For some, this newfound freedom was a blessing. In the north, cities of the Hanseatic League regained their influence, trading across the Baltic once more. Merchants carried spices, silks, and stories from the farthest corners of the known world. Artisans, freed from the fear of armies, returned to their crafts: wood carving, metalwork, the delicate art of clockmaking that would soon make Germany famous. In the south, the old duchies, Bavaria, Württemberg, Saxony, turned inward, focusing on stability, education, and faith. Monasteries rebuilt their libraries. Scholars, hungry for understanding after decades of chaos, reopened universities. A quiet intellectual awakening began to flicker within the rubble. The war had destroyed much, but it had also forced the people to look inward, to find meaning beyond the reach of swords. Still, for many, the peace was cruel. Mercenaries roamed the countryside, unable to adapt to a world without war. Banditry spread. Diseases followed the famine, sweeping through villages too weak to resist. There were whispers of witchcraft again, of demons blamed for the endless misfortune. Trials flared across small towns where fear outweighed reason. The old darkness of the Middle Ages seemed to return, wrapping itself around the fragile hope of rebirth. But history, like the Rhine, always flows forward. As decades passed, the ruins gave way to rebuilding. The great cathedrals were restored, their towers rising once more into the gray skies. The marketplaces filled with the murmur of trade, and new generations, born after the war, knew peace as something more than a distant dream. They learned to live not for empire, but for endurance. Germany, fragmented and fragile, began to take on a new identity. No longer a single power ruled by one emperor, it became a web of ideas, inventions, and ambitions. In the quiet halls of monasteries, thinkers began to question faith, power, and destiny itself. From this soil of devastation, the seeds of a new age, an age of enlightenment, were beginning to take root. The land still remembered its suffering. The forests still hid the ghosts of soldiers. But the people had learned a cruel and lasting truth: that survival is not granted by kings or emperors, but earned by the will of the common soul. As the evening mists settled once again over the Rhine, a weary farmer looked out over his small plot of land, once a battlefield, now blooming with wheat, and whispered to himself, "At last, the world is quiet." And in that silence, the new Germany was born. The dawn that followed the darkness of the 30 Years' War was unlike any that had come before. It was not a sunrise marked by triumph or banners. It was a quiet, hesitant light that crept across the ruins and whispered, "Live again." The scars of the old empire still marked the land, but through them, shoots of green began to rise. The silence of death was giving way to the hum of rebuilding, to the rhythm of hammers striking wood, wheels turning, and bells tolling once more in weary towns. Germany was no longer the empire of emperors and crusades. It was now a mosaic, 1,000 small realms, each with its own customs, rulers, and ambitions. What had once been a dream of unification had fragmented into countless shards, yet each fragment reflected light in its own way. From this fragmentation came something unexpected: diversity. No longer bound by the shadow of a single will, the people of the German lands began to shape their futures on their own terms. Trade returned first, like blood returning to a long-frozen limb. The Hanseatic League, once dormant under the weight of war, came alive again. The cities of Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen rose from the ashes, their harbors filled with the scent of salt and spice. Ships carried timber from Scandinavia, furs from the Baltic, and cloth from Flanders. Markets bustled once again, and the sound of foreign tongues returned to the cobblestone streets. In these cities, merchants became the new nobility, men whose power was measured not by lineage, but by gold, reputation, and trust. The countryside, too, began to change. Farmers who had survived the famine rebuilt their fields, restoring the rhythm of the seasons. Villages formed cooperatives, sharing tools and livestock to endure the hard years. Grain silos rose where watchtowers once stood. Slowly, painfully, the wounds of the land began to heal. Religion, once the sword that divided the realm, now found quieter forms. The people had grown weary of war in God's name. Churches rebuilt themselves not as fortresses of power, but as sanctuaries of peace. Catholic and Protestant lived side by side, separated by doctrine but united by exhaustion. The Peace of Westphalia had made tolerance a law, but time made it a habit. Priests preached humility instead of conquest, and hymns that once echoed over battlefields now rose over plowed fields and quiet towns. Amid this fragile peace, something unexpected stirred: a hunger for knowledge. The same devastation that had crushed faith in institutions sparked a new curiosity about the world itself. Monasteries once devoted to scripture became centers of study again, collecting books that had survived the flames. Scholars traveled between universities, Leipzig, Heidelberg, Tübingen, sharing discoveries about medicine, astronomy, and the natural world. The printing press, that miracle of German ingenuity, carried this rebirth across the land. Books once reserved for the elite now reached merchants, craftsmen, even farmers' sons. Knowledge spread like fire through dry grass, but this time, it was a fire that created instead of destroyed. And in these humble beginnings, the seeds of modern Germany began to take root. Not in the marble halls of emperors, but in the workshops, libraries, and classrooms of ordinary men and women. Science, philosophy, and art began to bloom again. The same hands that had built cathedrals now turned to build machines, instruments, and clocks, each one a symbol of precision, patience, and purpose. But the new age was not free from fear. The empire's political chaos still simmered beneath the surface. Local lords hoarded power, and rivalries between Catholic and Protestant states flared into tension. Still, war no longer ruled men's hearts. The people had tasted enough of blood. They sought not conquest, but stability. Through the 17th century, Germany became a quiet engine of European progress. Its scholars studied the heavens, its artisans refined their craft, its merchants knitted the continent together through trade. Out of ruin, a quieter, humbler greatness began to form, a strength not built on empires, but on endurance, intellect, and will. As evening fell over the rivers and rooftops of a slowly healing land, the same stars that had watched over the fires of war now glimmered above peaceful farms and bustling towns. And beneath their silver light, the people of Germany carried on, not as conquerors, not as victims, but as survivors. The empire was still divided, but within its fragments, a new light had begun to glow, steady, patient, and enduring. The peace had come, but it was a fragile peace, thin as parchment and easy to tear. With the emperor's crown now little more than a relic, true power in the Holy Roman Empire began to shift, quietly but decisively, into the hands of those who had survived the storm, the German princes. Once bound by the emperor's decrees, they were now sovereigns in their own right. rulers of miniature kingdoms, masters of fate within their own borders. And from the ashes of unity, they began to build new empires of their own. In every direction, the land glittered with small courts and palaces, each one competing to outshine the others. Bavaria, proud and Catholic, rebuilt its cities with grand Baroque splendor, filling them with churches that reached for heaven and frescoes that dripped with gold. Saxony, fiercely Protestant and ambitious, turned its eye toward culture and learning, transforming Dresden into a jewel of art and architecture. Brandenburg, poor but determined, began to dream of something larger, a disciplined, centralized state that would one day rise as the Kingdom of Prussia. Each prince ruled as if he were a king, complete with armies, courts, and diplomats. They minted their own coins, wrote their own laws, and forged alliances that often ignored the emperor entirely. The old idea of a single German nation faded into the background, replaced by a glittering chaos of ambition. The empire was no longer one voice. It was 1,000, each speaking its own language of power. In this world of shifting loyalties and endless ceremony, politics became an art form. Intrigue flourished in candlelit halls where noble families whispered behind velvet curtains. Marriages were no longer unions of love, but weapons of strategy. A wedding between two houses could alter the balance of power as surely as a war. Poison found its way into chalices, spies into confessionals, and secrets into the ink of private letters sealed with wax. Yet amid the rivalries and scheming, the princes also became patrons of culture. Their courts glittered with musicians, painters, and architects eager to impress. The echo of war gave way to the echo of violins and lutes. Cathedrals rose again, their ceilings painted with stories not of battle, but of beauty. The Renaissance had already touched Italy and France, but now, its spirit spread through the German lands, transformed into something more disciplined, more thoughtful, more introspective. Education, too, became a weapon of prestige. The great universities, Heidelberg, Leipzig, Wittenberg, flourished again, drawing students from across Europe. Philosophy, theology, and the sciences began to thrive under princely protection. From these halls would one day emerge the minds that would challenge the world's old beliefs. But beneath the surface of this glittering courtly life, the empire remained unstable. Each prince's rise came at the expense of unity. The emperor, stripped of real authority, presided over a realm he could no longer control. His title, Holy Roman Emperor, chosen by the grace of God, now rang hollow. The empire had become what some called neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. It was a ghost of its former self, held together only by tradition and name. And yet, there was beauty in its disorder. For within this fractured land, freedom of thought and creation took root. Artists painted not for one ruler, but for many. Ideas crossed borders more easily than armies. A scientist in Saxony could correspond with a philosopher in Bavaria. A composer in Hamburg could write music that echoed through the halls of Vienna. The empire's weakness became, in time, its strange strength. As the 17th century drew to a close, the princes had remade Germany in their image, ornate, divided, but alive. The emperor's shadow still lingered, but the light now came from 100 courts burning with their own ambitions. And in one of those courts, in a small, windswept corner of the north, a dynasty was quietly sharpening its sword and its will, a family that would one day reshape all of Germany, and with it, the future of Europe. That family's name was Hohenzollern. In the far north of the empire, where the mists of the Baltic rolled across dark forests and endless marshlands, a quiet power was beginning to rise. It did not glitter like Bavaria, nor sing like Saxony. Its palaces were modest, its cities austere. But beneath its gray skies, something harder than marble was being forged, a discipline, a will, a purpose. This was Brandenburg, Prussia, and at its heart stood the house of Hohenzollern. While other princes adorned their courts with art and song, the Hohenzollerns built something different, order. They understood that their land, poor and fragmented, could not compete with wealth or splendor. but it could build strength from obedience. It could rise through discipline, not decadence. Their vision was not one of luxury, but of endurance. When the 30 Years' War ended, Brandenburg lay in ruins. Its villages burned, its people scattered. Yet from this devastation emerged a man who would be remembered as the Great Elector, Frederick William of Brandenburg. He inherited a wasteland and turned it into a state. Through sheer will, he forged unity where chaos reigned. His soldiers, hardened and silent, became the backbone of his realm. His administration, strict, efficient, relentless, laid the foundations of a machine that would one day command Europe. Frederick William's rule was not gentle. He taxed without mercy, demanded loyalty without hesitation, and punished disobedience without hesitation. But under his iron hand, Brandenburg began to breathe again. He built canals that tied the Elbe and the Oder, rebuilt trade routes destroyed by war, and invited refugees, especially skilled Protestants fleeing France, to repopulate his lands. Where others saw only ruin, he saw potential. The Great Elector's greatest innovation, however, was his army. Small at first, it became his instrument of power, a professional, disciplined force that answered only to him. It was not the largest in Europe, but it was the most efficient, the most organized, and above all, the most feared. For the first time, Brandenburg-Prussia had found its voice, and that voice spoke through the marching of boots. Under the Hohenzollerns, military discipline became a way of life. Every citizen, noble or peasant, understood his place in the machine. Obedience was not only expected, it was sacred. From the smallest village to the halls of the elector's court, order ruled. Even the arts, when they came, reflected this precision. Music measured like clockwork, architecture symmetrical and unyielding. By the time Frederick William's son, Frederick I, took the throne, Brandenburg was ready for transformation. In 1701, with careful diplomacy and the blessing of the emperor, he crowned himself king in Prussia. The world barely noticed at first, but history did. A new kingdom had been born within the empire, a kingdom built not on gold, but on grit. Prussia's rise was not immediate, nor was it peaceful. It grew like a blade honed slowly on stone. Each ruler refined the state like a craftsman shaping steel, discipline upon discipline, law upon law, soldier upon soldier. The Prussian ideal became something almost mythic: obedience, sacrifice, precision. A nation built like a clock, every cog essential, every second accounted for. The Hohenzollerns were not loved, but they were respected, feared, even. Their power lay in their ability to make men believe that duty was destiny, that greatness could be achieved not through glory, but through labor. It was a philosophy that would, in time, reshape not only Germany but all of Europe. And yet, beneath this iron order, something human still stirred. In the quiet rooms of Berlin, scholars gathered, and thinkers debated the nature of freedom and authority. The Enlightenment had begun to touch even the austere lands of Prussia. The contrast between sword and reason, between order and curiosity, would define the kingdom's soul for centuries to come. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Hohenzollerns had turned a forgotten corner of the empire into a disciplined, modern state. They did not know it yet, but their legacy would one day forge the steel and fire that would unite all of Germany. For now, the drums of Prussia echoed softly across the northern plains, a steady, relentless rhythm, a warning and a promise. The age of princes was giving way to something new, an age of kings. And among them, Prussia would soon stand tallest. By the middle of the 18th century, the winds that swept across Europe carried whispers of a new power, cold, efficient, and unstoppable. Its banners bore the Black Eagle of Prussia, and at its helm stood a man who would change the destiny of his nation forever. Frederick II, known to history as Frederick the Great. Frederick was not born into peace, nor did he seek it. He was the heir of iron discipline, raised under the shadow of a father who ruled with fists and fury, Frederick William I, the Soldier King. From his earliest days, the young prince's life was a symphony of commands: wake at dawn, drill, march, obey. His father despised weakness, luxury, and art, three things his son adored. Where the elder king saw order as divine, the younger saw beauty as salvation. Their conflict was brutal, even tragic. Once, in a moment that would haunt him forever, Frederick tried to flee Prussia, dreaming of a life of freedom and music in France. He was caught. His friend and co-conspirator was executed before his eyes. The lesson was clear. In Prussia, there was no escape from duty. When Frederick finally ascended the throne in 1740, he carried both wounds and wisdom. The young king was brilliant, unpredictable, and ambitious beyond measure. He loved philosophy, played the flute with grace, and corresponded with the greatest minds of his age, including Voltaire. Yet beneath his cultured exterior beat the heart of a strategist. Frederick would prove that art and war could share the same hand. Barely had he worn the crown when he struck his first blow. With the precision of a chess master, he invaded Silesia, a wealthy province belonging to Austria. Europe watched in shock. This was no grand declaration, no holy cause. It was pure, calculated ambition. Against all odds, Prussia triumphed. The young king had dared to challenge the powerful Habsburgs, and he had won. The world began to take notice. The victory over Silesia was only the beginning. The following years plunged Europe into what would become the 7 Years' War, a conflict that spread from the heart of Germany to the far corners of the world. Prussia faced a coalition of giants: Austria, France, Russia, and even Sweden. By all logic, Frederick should have fallen. His kingdom was small, his enemies vast. Yet he fought with brilliance bordering on madness, marching his armies swiftly across impossible distances, striking before his foes could even react. His soldiers, drilled to perfection, became extensions of his will. Their movements on the battlefield were poetry in motion, disciplined, synchronized, lethal. Frederick's genius lay not in numbers, but in precision. He could turn defeat into stalemate, stalemate into survival, and survival into legend. For 7 brutal years, Prussia bled but did not break. Cities were burned, crops destroyed, and yet Frederick held on. His people called him Der Alte Fritz, Old Fritz, a title born of love and fear alike. And when at last the war ended, Prussia still stood, bruised, scarred, but unbroken. Against all odds, the small northern kingdom had faced the might of Europe and survived. With victory came transformation. Prussia was no longer a minor power. It had become a kingdom to be reckoned with. Frederick the Great turned Berlin into a center of learning and art, inviting philosophers, musicians, and architects from across the continent. His palaces, especially the serene Sanssouci, reflected his dual nature: the soldier and the scholar, the conqueror and the thinker. Yet Frederick's greatness was not without shadow. His wars left hundreds of thousands dead, his people burdened by taxation, his kingdom exhausted. He ruled as an enlightened despot, a king who believed in progress but trusted only himself to guide it. He reformed justice, tolerated religion, modernized bureaucracy, but never loosened his grip. Freedom was a privilege, not a right. And still, to his people, he was a symbol of pride. Under his reign, Prussia's name became synonymous with strength, precision, and resolve. The German lands, long divided, now had a new center of gravity, a power that looked beyond the Holy Roman Empire towards something greater, a vision of a unified, disciplined, modern nation. When Frederick died in 1786, he left behind not just a kingdom, but a legacy, a blueprint for Germany's future. His soldiers wept. His enemies exhaled. Europe, for a moment, was still. He was the philosopher king of the North, the man who proved that intellect and iron could coexist. And though his flute would never again play in the halls of Sanssouci, its melody lingered, echoing through history as the sound of an empire being born. The world had changed, and somewhere, in the heart of Europe, a quiet storm was gathering. The death of Frederick the Great marked more than the end of a reign. It marked the slow, inevitable twilight of an age. The Holy Roman Empire, that ancient and tangled web of crowns and crosses, was fading into shadow. For nearly 1,000 years, emperors had worn the mantle of Rome's legacy, claiming dominion over the German lands. But now, in the late 18th century, the idea of empire was no longer carved in stone. It was crumbling like old marble beneath the weight of modernity. Across Europe, the world was changing. The Enlightenment had lit a fire in the minds of men. Monarchs were no longer divine, and empires no longer eternal. The whispers of revolution carried from the salons of Paris to the beer halls of Munich. Even the air seemed charged with new ideas: freedom, reason, equality. Yet the Holy Roman Empire, vast and fragile, remained a relic of feudal times. 1,000 small states tied together by threads of ceremony and tradition, not strength. Its emperor, Francis II, wore the crown of Charlemagne, but his throne sat upon a crumbling foundation. He ruled not through might, but through memory, his authority more symbolic than sovereign. The princes of Germany bowed to him in ritual, but their loyalty belonged to their own ambitions. The empire that had once dreamed of uniting Christendom had become a patchwork of competing interests, Prussia and Austria circling each other like wolves, while smaller states, Saxony, Bavaria, Hanover, sought survival in the spaces between them. Meanwhile, in the streets of Paris, something extraordinary was unfolding. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, shattering the old order of kings and crowns. Monarchs across Europe trembled as the guillotine became the new symbol of power. The Holy Roman Empire, slow and ponderous, watched as the world it understood began to vanish. For the German princes, the revolution was both a warning and an opportunity. Some feared it, fortifying their cities and tightening their grip on power. Others embraced its ideals, whispering of reform and liberty. But as chaos consumed France, a new figure began to rise. A general of unmatched genius and ambition, a man who would sweep across Europe like a storm: Napoleon Bonaparte. At first, his name was little more than rumor, a curiosity from the south. But soon, his armies began to thunder across the Rhine, and the German world felt the ground tremble beneath their boots. Napoleon's conquests did not just threaten borders, they threatened the very idea of the old empire. Prussia, proud and disciplined, hesitated at first. Austria, clinging to its imperial pride, tried to resist. But Napoleon was unlike any ruler they had ever faced. He fought not for God or glory, but for destiny, his own. And as his victories multiplied, one truth became undeniable: the Holy Roman Empire could no longer survive in a world shaped by revolution and reason. In 1806, the final blow came. Napoleon defeated Austria and its allies, and Emperor Francis II, seeing the inevitable, did what no ruler before him had dared. He dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, ending more than 8 centuries of history with a single act. The ancient crown of Charlemagne was set aside, and with it, the dream of a unified, divine empire that had endured since the Middle Ages. For some, it was a tragedy; for others, a liberation. The old order was dead, and in its place rose something new, a modern Europe built not on faith, but on force and law. The German lands were reshaped under Napoleon's influence, reorganized into the Confederation of the Rhine, a loose alliance of states loyal to France. In Vienna, Francis II took a new title, Emperor of Austria, preserving a fragment of his dignity. But the old empire, that sprawling labyrinth of bishops and barons, had vanished forever. The bells that once tolled for coronations now rang for funerals. And yet, even in its death, the Holy Roman Empire left behind an echo, a longing for unity that would never quite fade. The people of the German lands, divided as ever, began to dream once more of a nation that could rise from the ruins, strong and whole. For now, though, the smoke of revolution still drifted across the continent, and the eagle of Prussia and the double-headed eagle of Austria watched each other warily across the blood-soaked fields of Europe. The old world was gone. The new world was being born in fire. And in the distance, beneath the roar of Napoleon's cannons, one could almost hear the whisper of the future, Germany's future, calling from beyond the storm. When the Holy Roman Empire fell in 1806, it seemed as though the story of Germany had ended. The crown that had once belonged to emperors and saints now lay buried beneath the weight of Napoleon's victories. The ancient order was gone, its thrones empty, its princes humbled, and its people scattered among the ashes of old loyalties. Yet in the silence that followed, something remarkable began to stir. Out of defeat came reflection, and out of humiliation, a strange new awakening. For centuries, Germans had thought of themselves not as one nation, but as countless little worlds, each with its own ruler, its own dialect, its own pride. Bavaria, Saxony, Prussia, Württemberg, all were fragments of a once mighty dream. But Napoleon, in his hunger for domination, did something no emperor before him had managed. He forced the German states to look at themselves as one people, bound not by imperial decree, but by shared suffering. His armies swept across the land like wildfire. He redrew borders, abolished ancient privileges, and replaced centuries-old traditions with the cold efficiency of French administration. Feudal lords lost their powers, monasteries were dissolved, and for the first time, ordinary citizens began to imagine a world where birth did not determine destiny. Napoleon's rule was harsh, but his reforms ignited minds long shackled by obedience. In Prussia, the defeat at Jena and Auerstedt, 1806, had shattered national pride. The once glorious Prussian army lay in ruins, its capital occupied by French troops. But from the humiliation rose voices of renewal. Reformers like Baron von Stein and Karl August von Hardenberg, who sought to rebuild their state not as a feudal relic, but as a modern nation. They abolished serfdom, reformed education, and began to train a new kind of army, not of mercenaries, but of citizens. Meanwhile, the poets and thinkers of the German lands began to dream aloud. Men like Johann Gottlieb Fichte spoke of a German spirit, a unity of language, culture, and destiny that no conqueror could erase. In his addresses to the German nation, Fichte declared that Germany's true power was not in its fractured thrones, but in its people, their discipline, their intellect, their sense of purpose. His words, once whispered in the salons of Berlin, soon became a quiet fire in the hearts of students and scholars across the land. Napoleon, ever confident, saw no threat in words. He crowned himself emperor, marched his armies eastward, and set his gaze on Russia. But behind him, the soil of Germany was changing. The French yoke had broken the chains of feudalism, but it also awakened a yearning for freedom. Freedom not only from kings, but from foreign masters. As the War of Liberation began in 1813, that yearning became action. Farmers, students, and soldiers alike took up arms under the black, red, and gold banners that would one day symbolize a united Germany. From the forests of Saxony to the plains of Silesia, the cry spread like wildfire. For God, for freedom, for the fatherland. Prussia, reborn through reform, stood once more at the head of the German cause. The battles were fierce, Lutzen, Botzen, Leipzig, and though Napoleon fought with the skill of a man destined for history's pages, his empire was cracking. At Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, over 500,000 men clashed in one of the greatest struggles Europe had ever seen. When the smoke cleared, Napoleon's star had begun to fall, and with it, the shadow that had loomed over Germany for a generation. By 1815, at the Congress of Vienna, the map of Europe was redrawn again. The Holy Roman Empire was gone forever, but in its place rose the German Confederation, a loose collection of 39 states bound together not by a single crown, but by a fragile promise of cooperation. It was imperfect, hesitant, and bound by the will of Austria and Prussia, yet it marked something new, a framework for unity, an echo of a shared destiny. The people of Germany were changing too. They had seen the strength that came from standing together and the weakness that came from division. They no longer spoke only of their dukes or bishops, but of Deutschland, a word that, for the first time, meant something more than geography. Napoleon had sought to destroy the German spirit. Instead, he had awakened it. The empire that once ruled through faith and fear had fallen, but in its ashes grew the seeds of a nation that would one day rise stronger than ever before. And as the fires of revolution dimmed across Europe, a new dawn began to glow faintly on the horizon, a dawn that would one day bring the birth of a united Germany, forged not by emperors or popes, but by the will of its people. When the cannons fell silent and the Congress of Vienna concluded in 1815, Europe exhaled, but it was not the sigh of peace. It was the weary breath of an old world forced to live again in a body too weak to hold its own weight. The kings and ministers who gathered in Vienna had one goal above all: to turn back the clock, to erase the chaos of revolution, to bury the memory of Napoleon, and to rebuild the throne and altar world that had ruled before the storm. But time does not move backward, and the seeds of change, once sown, do not die so easily. The German Confederation, 39 states, bound together under the loose presidency of Austria, was meant to restore stability. It replaced the Holy Roman Empire with a new structure, not a nation, but a balance of power. Austria and Prussia, eternal rivals, sat uneasily at its head, each watching the other with the suspicion of wolves forced to share a den. The smaller states, Bavaria, Saxony, Hanover, Württemberg, played their parts, but real power lay in Vienna and Berlin. To the rulers, the Confederation was a shield against revolution. To the people, it was a cage. The ideals of liberty, unity, and nationhood that had burned so fiercely during the wars against Napoleon were not extinguished. They had simply gone underground. Students, poets, and professors met in secret societies and candlelit taverns, whispering of a Germany free and united, a Germany of the people, not the princes. In 1817, on the hill of Wartburg, students gathered to celebrate the Reformation and the victory over Napoleon. But their true purpose was bolder: to demand a new Germany, bound by freedom of speech, equality before the law, and an end to foreign domination. Flags of black, red, and gold fluttered in the wind, the same colors carried by volunteers in the wars of liberation. Yet to the princes, those flags were not symbols of hope, they were warnings. Fear spread among the courts like a cold wind. Austria's aging statesman, Prince Clemens von Metternich, saw himself as the guardian of Europe's old order. He believed that ideas, freedom, nationalism, progress, were diseases, and his mission was to quarantine them. Under his direction, the Carlsbad Decrees of 1819 were passed. Universities were censored, student groups banned, newspapers silenced. The iron fist of repression closed around Germany, and for a time, it seemed as though Metternich had succeeded. But the fire still burned. Writers like Heinrich Heine and George Buchner turned their pens into weapons. In hidden corners, thinkers like Hegel and Marx studied the nature of power, history, and revolution. Beneath the polished marble of Vienna's salons and Berlin's palaces, something restless stirred, a generation that had seen both tyranny and freedom and would not be content with chains. Meanwhile, the world itself was changing. The Industrial Revolution crept into the German lands, bringing smoke, machines, and a new class of workers. Cities swelled with factories and railways. The rhythm of the anvil began to replace the toll of the church bell. Merchants, craftsmen, and laborers began to question the feudal order that still clung to power. For the first time, people began to see themselves not just as Saxons or Bavarians, but as Germans, united by language, culture, and shared hardship. By the 1830s, small uprisings flared across the Confederation. The Hambach Festival of 1832 saw thousands gather under the forbidden tricolor, demanding unity and liberty. In response, Metternich tightened his grip once more. But each act of repression only deepened the divide between rulers and ruled. Then, in 1848, the fire that Metternich had spent decades trying to contain finally burst into flame. Revolution erupted first in France, then spread like wildfire across Europe, to Vienna, Berlin, and beyond. Barricades rose in the streets, and for the first time, the common people of Germany, students, workers, and citizens, stood together and demanded a nation of their own. Metternich fled Vienna in disguise, the symbol of an age swept away by the tide of history. In Frankfurt, delegates gathered for the Frankfurt Parliament, the first attempt to create a unified German constitution. Hope filled the air. The dream of centuries was within reach. But unity, once again, proved elusive. The princes hesitated, Prussia schemed, and Austria obstructed. The revolutionaries argued among themselves. Should Germany be a monarchy or a republic? Should Austria be included or excluded? While they debated, the old powers regrouped. By 1849, the dream had collapsed. The Frankfurt Parliament dissolved, the uprisings were crushed, and the soldiers of the princes once more patrolled the streets. Yet even in defeat, something had changed forever. The people had spoken, not in whispers, but in thunder. The word Deutschland was now more than an idea. It was a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The embers of 1848 did not die. They smoldered quietly, waiting for a man strong enough, ruthless enough, to turn that promise into reality. And soon, that man would emerge from the heart of Prussia, with iron in his soul and destiny in his grasp. Out of the ashes of revolution and the weariness of broken dreams, a new figure began to rise in Prussia, a man who believed not in speeches or ideals, but in power. His name was Otto von Bismarck, and history would remember him as the Iron Chancellor, the architect who forged Germany not through words or votes, but through blood and iron. In 1848, as the streets of Berlin erupted in chaos, Bismarck was still a young conservative diplomat, loyal to the Prussian king and skeptical of the revolutionaries who spoke of freedom and unity. He saw them as naive dreamers, men who mistook poetry for politics. To him, the world was not shaped by ideals. It was shaped by strength, will, and the cold steel of armies. As the revolutions crumbled and the old order returned, Bismarck's star began to rise. He served as Prussian ambassador to Frankfurt, then to St. Petersburg and Paris. In those years, he studied the great powers of Europe, learning their weaknesses and watching their rivalries. Beneath his calm exterior burned a ruthless intelligence. He understood something no one else did. Germany could only be united by force, and Prussia was the only state strong enough to do it. By 1862, Prussia was in crisis. The parliament was locked in a bitter struggle with King Wilhelm I over military reforms. The liberals wanted constitutional control. The king demanded absolute authority. Just as the monarchy seemed ready to collapse, Bismarck was summoned to Berlin. When he stood before the deputies, his speech would define an era. The great questions of the day, he declared, will not be decided by speeches and majority votes, but by blood and iron. Those words shocked the chamber, but they captured Bismarck's vision perfectly. He did not dream of a democratic Germany or a romantic fatherland. He dreamed of a Prussian-led empire, forged in war and bound by discipline. He would build it step by step, through cunning diplomacy and calculated violence. First, he secured Prussia's military might, reorganizing the army under Helmuth von Moltke and Albrecht von Roon, two men whose brilliance would soon shake Europe. Then, he set out to isolate Prussia's rivals one by one. His first target was Denmark. In 1864, Bismarck provoked a war over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, territories claimed by both Denmark and the German states. With Austria as an uneasy ally, Prussian troops swept through the Danish defenses. The victory was swift and deliberate. Bismarck had gained the duchies, but he had also planted the seeds of conflict with Austria, his supposed partner. 2 years later, he turned that alliance into enmity. Through manipulation, provocation, and sheer nerve, Bismarck lured Austria into a confrontation over the administration of those same duchies. The result was the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. Europe watched in disbelief as tiny Prussia challenged the ancient Habsburg Empire. But Bismarck's army was no ordinary force. It was modern, disciplined, and armed with the new needle gun, a weapon that could fire 3 times faster than its Austrian counterpart. In just 7 weeks, Austria was crushed. The decisive victory at Königgrätz ended centuries of Habsburg dominance in Germany. Bismarck, in a masterstroke of restraint, refused to humiliate Austria. Instead, he offered peace and allowed it to withdraw gracefully from German affairs. The result was monumental. Austria was out, and Prussia now stood unchallenged as the leader of northern Germany. From the ruins of war, Bismarck created the North German Confederation, a modern, centralized state under Prussian control. He gave it a constitution, a veneer of democracy hiding the iron hand of monarchy. For the first time, millions of Germans lived under a single flag, answering not to Vienna, but to Berlin. But Bismarck's ambition did not end there. He knew that a united Germany would never be complete without the southern states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden. They remained independent, wary of Prussia's power. Only a great external threat could compel them to join the northern cause. And so, Bismarck began to watch France. The aging Emperor Napoleon III, jealous of Prussia's growing influence, sought to assert his authority in Europe. The two men would soon become locked in a deadly game of deception, pride, and war, a game that would decide the fate of the continent. Bismarck had unified the North through calculation and conquest. To unite all of Germany, he would need something far greater, a war that would awaken every German heart, a conflict that would turn the dream of unity into unbreakable steel. That war was coming, and when it did, Europe would never be the same again. By the late summer of 1870, Europe stood at the edge of a storm. The sky over Paris darkened with rumor and pride, and far to the east, in the disciplined heart of Prussia, the engines of war were already turning. Otto von Bismarck, the man who had once sworn that Germany's destiny would be written in blood and iron, was preparing to write its final chapter. The trigger came from a seemingly minor dispute, the Spanish succession crisis. A distant relative of the Prussian king had been offered the Spanish throne, and though he declined, France felt mocked. Emperor Napoleon III, desperate to restore his fading prestige, demanded that Prussia renounce the claim publicly and forever. King Wilhelm I, polite but proud, refused. What followed was a single telegram that changed history. From the spa town of Ems, the king sent a brief report of his conversation with the French ambassador. Bismarck received it in Berlin, with a few calculated edits, sharpening a polite message into a sharp insult. He released what became known as the EMS dispatch. Overnight, France erupted in fury. Paris shouted for war, and Bismarck smiled in silence. He had gotten exactly what he wanted. France would strike first, and the German states would rally to Prussia's defense. When war was declared, the transformation was immediate. Bells rang from the Rhineland to Bavaria. Volunteers flooded recruiting stations. For the first time in centuries, Germans of every province, north and south, Catholic and Protestant, stood shoulder to shoulder beneath one flag. The old divisions dissolved in the roar of unity. The French army, proud but unprepared, marched east under the illusion of superiority. They met instead the cold precision of the Prussian war machine, a machine that moved on railways, communicated by telegraph, and struck with mathematical efficiency. At Wissembourg, Spicheren, and Gravelotte, French courage met German discipline, and discipline prevailed. The needle gun and the Krupp cannon tore through the old Napoleonic tactics like thunder through clouds. By September 1870, the French army was trapped at Sedan. Napoleon III, cornered and surrounded, surrendered with 100,000 men. The empire of the Bonapartes collapsed in a single day. In Paris, revolution erupted once more, birthing the Third Republic, but the new government refused to yield. The Prussian armies surrounded the capital, cutting off food, water, and hope. For months, the city endured siege and starvation while Bismarck watched impassively from Versailles. The palace that had once symbolized French glory, now serving as the stage for Germany's triumph. It was there, on January 18, 1871, that destiny came full circle. In the Hall of Mirrors, beneath ceilings painted with the victories of Louis XIV, the German princes assembled. As sunlight streamed through the windows and reflected on walls of glass and gold, King Wilhelm I of Prussia was proclaimed Emperor of a united Germany, the Kaiser. The air trembled with the echoes of history. Trumpets sounded, banners unfurled. For the first time, a single empire stretched from the Baltic to the Alps, bound not by papal blessing or imperial decree, but by the will of its people and the genius of one iron-willed statesman. Outside, cannons thundered in salute, but the mood inside Versailles was colder, heavier. Even amid victory, some sensed the price that had been paid. France lay humiliated, its pride shattered. Germany, newly born, carried within it both glory and danger. Bismarck, ever pragmatic, understood what few others did. The empire forged in war would always bear the scars of its birth. When the peace treaty was signed, Germany took Alsace and Lorraine, provinces rich in industry and memory. The French swore vengeance. Across Europe, kings and ministers watched uneasily as the new empire, united and powerful, stood where once had been 100 fractured states. The coronation in Versailles marked the end of one age and the dawn of another. The Holy Roman Empire had fallen into dust. From its bones rose the German Empire, modern, industrial, and ambitious, a colossus born not of faith, but of fire. As Bismarck looked upon the gathered princes and generals, a rare flicker of emotion crossed his face. For 20 years, he had played the game of nations with unmatched cunning, moving pieces across the board of Europe like a master chess player. Now, at last, the board was his. Yet even he could not foresee how the empire he built in triumph would one day be tested by the same forces that had created it: ambition, nationalism, and the unyielding march of destiny. For now, however, the fires of war dimmed, and a new empire stood tall beneath the iron cross of victory. The age of blood and iron had reached its peak. The war was over, the cannons silent. Yet even in triumph, the air over Europe felt heavy, as if the smoke of battle refused to fade. The German Empire, newly crowned in the Hall of Mirrors, stood radiant and unshakable, a colossus of discipline, steel, and ambition. But beneath the brilliance of its victory lay the faint tremor of unease. Empires born of war rarely find peace easily. In the years following 1871, Germany transformed at a pace that stunned the world. Cities that had once been medieval fortresses became industrial giants. Railways stretched across the land like veins of iron, carrying coal, steel, and the heartbeat of progress. The hum of machines replaced the toll of church bells. Smokestacks rose where monasteries once stood. A generation earlier, Germany had been a mosaic of kingdoms and duchies. Now it was a single organism, alive with purpose and power. At its center stood Otto von Bismarck, not a king but something greater, a man who ruled through intellect, manipulation, and fear. As chancellor, he had achieved what centuries of emperors had not: unity. But now came the harder task: keeping it. Bismarck understood that victory could breed destruction as easily as glory. France was humiliated and thirsted for revenge. Austria watched warily from the south. Russia eyed Prussia's growing might. And Britain, mistress of the seas, measured this new landlocked empire with cautious curiosity. Europe was a chessboard of rivals, and one wrong move could ignite another inferno. So Bismarck became not a warrior, but a weaver of webs. Through alliances, treaties, and deception, he sought to isolate France and keep the peace, not from kindness, but from calculation. He forged the Three Emperors' League with Russia and Austria, balancing old enemies through careful diplomacy. When that failed, he crafted new pacts, such as the dual alliance with Austria in 1879 and the Triple Alliance when Italy joined 2 years later. Each alliance was a thread in a vast network designed to keep Germany safe and the peace fragile but intact. Yet within the empire, new storms brewed. The unity forged on the battlefield began to strain under the weight of politics, religion, and ideology. Bismarck feared no foreign army as much as he feared internal division. The Catholic Church, with its vast influence, seemed to him a rival to national loyalty. In response, he launched the Kulturkampf, the culture struggle. Laws were passed to control the church, priests were imprisoned, and religious schools were closed. But the campaign backfired. The faithful resisted, and Bismarck, pragmatic as ever, eventually withdrew, declaring peace with the Vatican. He then turned his gaze to the rising Social Democratic Party, whose calls for workers' rights and equality terrified the aristocracy. To crush them, he passed anti-socialist laws, censored newspapers, and exiled leaders. But again, Bismarck's genius revealed itself in contradiction. While he suppressed socialism with one hand, he stole its ideas with the other. He created the world's first welfare state, introducing health insurance, accident insurance, and old age pensions. To many, he was both tyrant and savior, a man who ruled through fear but governed with foresight. By the 1880s, Germany had become the industrial heart of Europe. Its factories produced steel, chemicals, and weapons in staggering quantities. Its universities led the world in science and philosophy. Berlin glittered with modernity, and the Prussian eagle flew proudly over colonies in Africa and the Pacific. Yet for all its power, the empire rested on uneasy foundations. The old nobility still dominated politics. The workers toiled in poverty beneath their smokestacks, and nationalism, that mighty force which had united Germany, now began to turn inward, seeking new enemies. Bismarck sensed this danger keenly. He often said that Germany was a saturated power, meaning it should not expand further. It should preserve, not provoke. He had no desire for reckless conquest. His goal was stability. But the young Kaiser Wilhelm II, who ascended the throne in 1888, had no patience for the old man's caution. Impulsive, proud, and obsessed with glory, Wilhelm saw himself as a modern Caesar, destined to lead Germany into a new century of empire and dominance. The clash between the Iron Chancellor and the Iron Crown was inevitable. Bismarck, weary but still shrewd, tried to control the young Kaiser through manipulation. Wilhelm, eager to escape the shadow of his mentor, grew restless. Their meetings turned cold, their correspondence sharp. Finally, in 1890, the unthinkable happened. Otto von Bismarck, the maker of modern Germany, was dismissed. He left Berlin bitter and silent, retiring to his estate in Friedrichsruh. When he departed, he told a friend, "The great questions of the future will no longer be decided by me. But I fear that they will be decided too quickly and too rashly." The empire he had built stood strong, disciplined, rich, and proud, but it was also fragile, a machine that needed the steady hand of its creator to guide it. Without him, the gears would begin to grind against each other, slowly, dangerously. The age of blood and iron had given birth to an empire of steel and pride. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the glitter of progress and the hum of industry, thunder began to rumble once again. The year was 1890, and a new age was dawning, not just for Germany, but for the world. The Iron Chancellor was gone, his shadow fading into the mist of history. In his place stood Kaiser Wilhelm II, young, restless, and burning with ambition. He was a man of contradictions, charismatic yet insecure, charming yet volatile. Born with a withered arm from birth, he carried within him a lifelong hunger to prove himself, to his people, to his ancestors, and to the watching world. He looked at the map of Europe and saw not borders, but opportunities. Where Bismarck had sought balance and caution, Wilhelm sought grandeur and dominion. The young Kaiser envisioned Germany not merely as a continental power, but as a global empire, one that would rival Britain's vast dominion and France's colonial might. He dreamed of a place in the sun, a phrase that would come to define his reign. Under Wilhelm's rule, the empire's tone shifted dramatically. The disciplined restraint of the old Prussian state gave way to a feverish nationalism, an intoxication with might and modernity. The Kaiser adored the military, its uniforms, its parades, its precision. He saw himself as the supreme commander, the embodiment of German strength. He surrounded himself with generals, admirals, and courtiers who fed his appetite for flattery and glory. And so began the age of militarism. The German army, already Europe's finest, grew larger and more mechanized. Yet it was the navy that captured Wilhelm's imagination. Britain ruled the seas with its mighty Royal Navy, and to challenge that dominance was both folly and fascination. But the Kaiser was determined. He turned to Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, who shared his vision of a fleet so powerful that it could rival Britain's, perhaps even defeat it. The result was the Tirpitz Plan, a vast program to construct battleships, cruisers, and submarines at unprecedented speed. Massive shipyards along the North Sea roared to life. The Kiel Canal expanded to allow the passage of dreadnoughts, the era's most fearsome warships. In Berlin and Hamburg, posters proclaimed Germany's destiny upon the seas. Children played with toy ships, and newspapers glorified the coming age of maritime supremacy. But as Germany's navy grew, so too did Britain's suspicion. The two nations entered an arms race, each building more and more dreadnoughts, each claiming it sought only peace while preparing for war. The North Sea became a symbol of looming conflict, a chessboard of steel where two titans maneuvered for supremacy. Beyond Europe, Germany sought to expand its reach. It claimed colonies in Africa, German East Africa, Southwest Africa, Togo, and Cameroon, and in the Pacific, from New Guinea to Samoa. Yet these territories, while grand on maps, were often remote and costly to maintain. Still, they fed the empire's sense of pride and destiny. Wilhelm's foreign policy, dubbed Weltpolitik, world policy, aimed to project German influence across the globe. He meddled in international affairs, often with disastrous results. In 1896, he sent the infamous Kruger telegram congratulating the Boers for resisting British control in South Africa, a move that outraged London. Later, in 1905 and 1911, he sparked crises in Morocco, challenging France's influence and nearly dragging Europe into war. At home, Germany flourished and festered in equal measure. Its cities glowed with electric light. Its scientists and engineers reshaped modern life. Figures like Einstein, Planck, and Haber turned German universities into the envy of the world. Industry boomed, railways stretched endlessly, and a new urban middle class rose from the ashes of the old feudal order. Yet beneath the surface, the cracks widened. Workers filled the factories, their hands building the empire's strength, but their hearts simmering with resentment. The Social Democratic Party grew rapidly, giving voice to millions who felt excluded from the empire's promise. Aristocrats sneered at them, industrialists feared them, and the Kaiser despised them. The gap between rich and poor grew sharper with every factory whistle that blew. Germany was a paradox, a nation both ancient and modern, disciplined yet restless, proud yet insecure. Its people sang of unity and destiny, but they also whispered of exhaustion. The empire's pulse quickened, its pride hardened into arrogance. Bismarck's careful diplomacy was gone, replaced by Wilhelm's impulsive proclamations and unpredictable gestures. The European balance, once delicately maintained, now tilted dangerously toward chaos. By 1914, Germany had become the most powerful state on the continent, industrial titan, military giant, and cultural beacon. But its greatness came with a shadow. Its neighbors watched in fear, its leaders played with fire, and its emperor stood convinced that destiny favored him. And then, on a summer day in June, far from Berlin, in the quiet streets of Sarajevo, a gunshot shattered the fragile peace that had held for decades. The sound of that single bullet would echo through every palace and village, every battlefield and graveyard, from the Rhine to the Russian plains. The age of empires was about to end, in fire, blood, and ruin. The summer of 1914 began with sunlight and festivals. In Berlin, the cafes were full, the parks alive with music, and the air carried a strange, electric excitement. No one knew that within weeks, Europe would collapse into a nightmare from which it would never fully awaken. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, most Germans paid little attention. But behind palace doors, telegrams flew, alliances trembled, and the machinery of destiny began to move. When Austria declared war on Serbia, Germany pledged its support, bound by loyalty, pride, and a hunger for dominance. The Kaiser, once blustering about peace, now spoke of honor and fate. His generals, Moltke, Falkenhayn, Hindenburg, and Ludendorff, prepared for a war unlike any the world had seen. They believed it would be quick, decisive, and glorious. It would be anything but. The Schlieffen Plan, a grand strategy drawn years before, called for a lightning strike through Belgium to crush France before Russia could mobilize. It was a gamble that depended on speed, precision, and luck. But when German troops crossed the Belgian border, they awakened the fury of Europe. Britain declared war. Russia advanced from the east. What began as a regional conflict now became a world war. At first, victory seemed close. The German army, efficient and relentless, swept across Belgium and northern France. Their gray uniforms marched like waves of steel under the thunder of artillery. In early battles, towns fell swiftly, and the dream of conquering Paris seemed within reach. Yet at the Marne River, the advance was halted. The French held their ground. The German army dug trenches, and so did everyone else. What followed was hell on earth. From the North Sea to the Swiss border stretched a scar of mud, wire, and death. Soldiers lived like ghosts in the filth of the trenches, cold, wet, and haunted by the constant scream of shells. The once proud sons of Germany, farmers, students, craftsmen, now huddled in dugouts, their faces caked in dirt, their ears ringing with the endless thunder of war. In those years, the world changed forever. The sky filled with airplanes, the sea with submarines, and the air with poison gas. At Verdun, hundreds of thousands died for a few yards of ground. At the Somme, machine guns cut down men like grass. Entire villages vanished beneath artillery fire. The land itself seemed to bleed. Back home, Germany groaned under the weight of war. The government promised victory, but food grew scarce, coal was rationed, and inflation devoured wages. Mothers stood in endless breadlines. Children grew thin and pale. Letters from the front became fewer, and the church bells tolled too often. The songs of patriotism that once filled the streets faded into whispers of despair. The Kaiser, once cheered by millions, now appeared increasingly detached. Real power shifted to the generals, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who ruled the empire like warlords. They demanded total mobilization. Every factory, every man, every grain of wheat was devoted to the war machine. The dream of honor had turned into a hunger for survival. By 1917, exhaustion gripped the nation. The U-boat campaign, meant to starve Britain into submission, only brought the United States into the war. America's vast resources and fresh soldiers tipped the balance against Germany. At the same time, revolution erupted in Russia, toppling the Tsar and pulling the Eastern Front into chaos. For a moment, it seemed like salvation. Germany signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, seizing vast lands. But the victory was hollow. The people no longer believed. In factories and cities, workers went on strike. In the Navy, sailors mutinied, refusing to die for a lost cause. Hunger riots broke out. The black market thrived. The iron discipline that had built the empire began to crumble. In 1918, one final gamble, the Spring Offensive, threw everything Germany had left into battle. For a few fleeting weeks, they pushed the Allies back. The guns roared with desperate fury, and Berlin dared to hope. But the tide soon turned. The Allies counterattacked with fresh American troops, tanks, and overwhelming firepower. The German lines broke. The soldiers, gaunt and disillusioned, began to retreat. The empire was dying. Its leaders still spoke of honor, but the truth was written in the faces of its soldiers. Eyes hollow, uniforms tattered, spirits broken. In November 1918, as revolution swept through the streets, Kaiser Wilhelm II fled into exile in the Netherlands. The monarchy that had ruled for centuries vanished overnight. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. The Great War, the war that was meant to end all wars, had devoured over 16 million lives. Germany, once the proud empire of steel and glory, lay in ruins, its people starving, its army defeated, its spirit shattered. The men returned home to find not triumph, but emptiness. The streets they had left were filled with widows and orphans. The empire they had fought for was gone. The dream of unity had turned into a nightmare of loss. The war had ended, but peace did not come with silence. It came with chaos. Germany in November 1918 was not a nation celebrating victory, but one collapsing under the weight of its own ruin. In the streets of Berlin, red flags replaced imperial banners. The Kaiser's grand palaces, once symbols of power and permanence, stood empty. The empire that had once ruled Europe through iron and discipline had simply dissolved. It began with mutiny. In the northern port of Kiel, sailors, starved and desperate, refused a final suicidal order to sail against the British fleet. They raised red flags, symbols of revolution, and their defiance spread like wildfire through the nation. Soldiers laid down their rifles. Workers took to the streets. Councils, formed across cities, inspired by the recent Russian Revolution. The monarchy's grip melted away. In the capital, protests turned to uprising. The government faltered, ministers fled. And on November 9, 1918, the empire's 1,000-year-old crown fell in a single day. Kaiser Wilhelm II, once the most powerful man in Europe, fled across the Dutch border, a broken exile haunted by his own hubris. In Berlin, politician Philipp Scheidmann, standing on a balcony of the Reichstag, declared to the cheering crowd below, "The German Republic is proclaimed." Just hours later, another man, Karl Liebknecht, a revolutionary socialist, declared a different republic, a free socialist Germany. Two visions of the future clashed in the same moment, one seeking democracy, the other revolution. The empire's corpse gave birth not to peace, but to confusion. The armistice signed on November 11th ended the fighting, but not the suffering. Germany was forced to accept humiliating terms. Its armies were to disband, its weapons surrendered, its borders redrawn. The once mighty empire was now a defeated nation, kneeling before the victors. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, would cut deeper still. It stripped Germany of territory, colonies, and pride. It blamed Germany alone for the war, demanding reparations so vast they could never truly be paid. In every cafe, every home, the same word echoed, Dolchstoß, the stab in the back. Many Germans refused to believe their army had truly been defeated. They were told they had been betrayed by politicians, by socialists, by Jews, by those who had stabbed the soldiers in the back. It was a lie born of anger, but one that would poison generations. Amid this bitterness, a fragile government tried to hold the pieces together. The new republic took its name from the peaceful city of Weimar, where the Constitution was written. It promised freedom, democracy, and hope, a modern Germany rising from the ashes. But the Weimar Republic was born into a storm. The economy collapsed under the weight of reparations and war debts. Factories closed. The mark plummeted in value. In 1923, the crisis reached its peak. Hyperinflation turned money into paper worth less than the ink it was printed with. People carried wages home in wheelbarrows, only to find that a loaf of bread cost more an hour later. Savings vanished overnight. The middle class, the pride of Germany's progress, was destroyed. Meanwhile, the streets remained battlegrounds. On one side stood the Spartacists, radical leftists led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who dreamed of a communist Germany. On the other stood nationalist militias, the Freikorps, bands of ex-soldiers who despised both communism and the republic that had replaced the Kaiser. They fought in the streets, sometimes block by block, leaving cities scarred and soaked in blood. In January 1919, the Spartacist uprising in Berlin was crushed. Luxemburg and Liebknecht were captured and murdered by the Freikorps. Their bodies were thrown into a canal. Two voices silenced, their ideals drowned in the mud of revolution. It was a brutal reminder that the old ghosts of empire had not vanished. They had simply traded their uniforms for new flags. As years passed, Germany became a nation of contradictions. Its art, literature, and philosophy flourished. Bauhaus, Expressionism, and cabaret culture redefined modernity. But beneath that brilliance was despair. Veterans limped through the streets, disillusioned and forgotten. Farmers went bankrupt. Political assassinations became common. Every ideology fought for control. Every faction claimed to be Germany's salvation. The Weimar Republic was not without hope. It saw moments of light. A new constitution, brave attempts at democracy, and leaders who truly believed in peace. But it was also fragile, surrounded by enemies from every direction: communists, monarchists, nationalists, all convinced that democracy was weak, foreign, and doomed. And among the angry and forgotten, in the beer halls of Munich, a new voice began to rise. A voice that promised revenge for the humiliation of Versailles, that spoke to the hunger, fear, and fury of the people. It came not from the nobility or the generals, but from a former soldier, bitter, restless, and waiting for his chance. His name was Adolf Hitler. Germany in the early 1920s was a wounded animal, bleeding, humiliated, and desperate to find meaning again. The scars of the Great War still throbbed in every town and family. Millions of men had returned from the trenches broken in body and spirit. The flag of the empire was gone, its emperor forgotten, and in its place stood a fragile republic that few truly believed in. The people craved order, strength, and purpose, but what they received instead was chaos. In this landscape of despair, one man's voice began to echo louder than the rest. His name was Adolf Hitler, a failed artist turned soldier who had spent the post-war years drifting through Munich streets, consumed by rage and bitterness. Like many veterans, he felt betrayed by politicians and elites. But unlike others, he possessed something more dangerous than anger. He had the ability to turn that anger into words. Munich was fertile ground for extremism. It was a city boiling with resentment, where right-wing militias and left-wing revolutionaries clashed nightly. Amid this turmoil, Hitler joined a small nationalist group known as the German Workers' Party, DAP. It was a fringe movement, poorly organized, with only a few dozen members. But Hitler's fiery speeches soon transformed it. By 1920, it had a new name: the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. At first, few took him seriously. He was just another loud voice in a country filled with angry men. But when he spoke, people listened. His words struck deep. He spoke of betrayal, of the November criminals who had signed the armistice, of communists and Jews who, he claimed, had stabbed the nation in the back. He promised not just recovery, but revenge. To those who had lost everything, his message felt like salvation. By 1923, inflation had reached madness. Money became worthless. People burned banknotes to keep warm. Children played with stacks of marks as if they were toys. Germany was collapsing again, and in that collapse, Hitler saw opportunity. He looked to Italy, where Mussolini had marched on Rome and seized power. Why not do the same in Germany? On the night of November 8, 1923, Hitler and his followers stormed a Munich beer hall where local leaders were gathered. Firing his pistol into the ceiling, he declared a revolution. The beer hall putsch, as it came to be known, was his attempt to overthrow the government of Bavaria and eventually Germany itself. But the coup failed. Police opened fire. 16 Nazis were killed, and Hitler was arrested. Many thought it was the end of him, but it was only the beginning. During his trial, Hitler turned defeat into triumph. Standing before the court, he transformed the proceedings into a stage for his propaganda. He admitted what he had done, but he claimed he had acted out of love for Germany. His words resonated across the nation, and even the judges treated him with surprising sympathy. Convicted of treason, he was sentenced to 5 years, but served only 9 months. It was in prison that Hitler began to shape his vision. Behind the gray walls of Landsberg prison, he dictated a book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a toxic manifesto of racism, hatred, and ambition. In it, he laid out everything: His belief in Aryan supremacy, his hatred of Jews and Marxists, his dream of rebuilding Germany through dictatorship and conquest. Few read it seriously at the time, but the seeds of future horror were already sown. When Hitler was released in 1924, Germany had begun to stabilize. The Weimar Republic, under leaders like Gustav Stresemann, achieved temporary recovery. The Dawes Plan helped restore the economy. New currency replaced the worthless mark. Life, for a time, seemed to return to normal. The Nazis faded into obscurity, their rallies reduced to a handful of followers. But Hitler was patient. He knew the German soul was still restless, and when crisis returned, he would be ready. The late 1920s saw Germany's brief golden age. Modern art, jazz, cinema, and science flourished. But beneath the surface, discontent lingered. Many resented the culture of modernity, calling it decadent and foreign. The army, stripped of power, simmered in resentment. Farmers suffered. National pride remained wounded by Versailles. Then, in 1929, came the Great Depression. The collapse of the American stock market rippled across the world, and Germany, dependent on foreign loans, was hit hardest of all. Factories closed. Millions lost their jobs. Hunger returned to the cities. People once again lined up for bread, just as they had after the war. Desperation turned to anger, and anger turned to fear. And into that fear stepped Adolf Hitler once more. His speeches grew darker, more powerful, and more mesmerizing. He promised jobs, food, and national renewal. He blamed the old parties for Germany's misery and called the Republic weak, corrupt, and un-German. His rallies were grand spectacles, swastikas, torches, and marching bands blending politics with theater. To a nation on its knees, he offered something intoxicating, hope disguised as strength. By 1932, the Nazi Party was no longer a fringe movement. It was the largest political force in Germany. The old elites, terrified of communism, thought they could control Hitler by inviting him into government. They were wrong. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Crowds gathered outside the Reich Chancellery, cheering and saluting as torchlight flickered in the winter air. The man who had once tried to seize power by force had now seized it legally. The Republic was dead, it just didn't know it yet. The cold winter of 1933 carried with it a strange silence, a silence that always comes before the storm. On the surface, Germany seemed calm. After years of political chaos, people told themselves that at last, order had returned. The new chancellor, Adolf Hitler, spoke of national unity, of rebuilding pride and restoring strength. His words were sharp yet comforting, his promises simple yet powerful. To many Germans, weary of hunger and humiliation, he seemed not like a politician, but a savior. But beneath that calm, the ground was shifting. Within weeks of taking office, Hitler began dismantling the fragile democracy that had brought him to power. The Reichstag fire, which erupted on a cold February night in 1933, was the spark he needed. The German parliament building burned, flames licking the sky over Berlin. A young communist was arrested and blamed, though the truth remains clouded in suspicion. To Hitler, the fire was a gift. He declared that Germany was under attack by enemies of the state and demanded emergency powers to protect the nation. The next day, civil liberties were suspended. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assemble, all vanished overnight. Police could arrest anyone, at any time, without trial. Fear seeped into every home, every conversation. People lowered their voices in cafes, unsure who might be listening. Soon after, came the Enabling Act, a law that gave Hitler the power to rule by decree. It passed on March 23, 1933, in a parliament surrounded by Nazi troops. Many deputies voted yes out of fear, others out of blind hope. Only the Social Democrats stood against it, their leader shouting before his arrest, "You can take our lives and our freedom, but not our honor." His voice was swallowed by the thunder of Nazi applause. And so, democracy died, not with an explosion, but with a vote. From that moment on, Germany became a different world. Political parties were outlawed. Trade unions were dissolved and replaced with the German Labor Front, controlled by the Nazis. Judges, teachers, and police swore oaths not to the Constitution, but to Hitler himself. The press became a weapon of propaganda. Everywhere, the red banner with the black swastika unfurled, a symbol that promised rebirth but heralded terror. Those who resisted disappeared into the shadows of new prisons. The first concentration camps, like Dachau, established in 1933. At first, they held political opponents, communists, journalists, priests, anyone who dared to question. But soon, their gates would open to others, the marginalized, the unwanted, and above all, the Jews. For centuries, Jewish families had lived in Germany, scholars, merchants, soldiers, citizens. But the Nazis needed enemies to bind their followers together. Through lies and propaganda, they painted Jews as the source of every German failure. Newspapers like Der Stürmer filled the streets with hatred. Anti-Semitic laws followed swiftly. Jews were stripped of government jobs, banned from public life, and forced to register their businesses. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 went further still, declaring Jews no longer citizens, forbidding marriage between Jews and non-Jews, and legally dividing neighbors, friends, and even families. The hatred spread quietly, like poison in water. Many Germans looked away. Others convinced themselves it was necessary, a step toward national renewal. But the darkness was only deepening. At the same time, Hitler consolidated control over the army. After the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, when he ordered the execution of his own allies in the SA to appease the military, the old generals swore loyalty to him personally. The oath was not to Germany, but to Adolf Hitler. The last check on his power was gone. When President Hindenburg died that same year, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer, leader of the German Reich. The transformation was complete. A nation of poets, philosophers, and engineers had become a nation under absolute rule. But Hitler's vision stretched beyond borders. He dreamed of empire, of a greater Germany that would dominate Europe and cleanse it of what he called weakness. The Wehrmacht, the new German army, grew in secret, violating the Treaty of Versailles. Factories hummed again, not for peace, but for war. Tanks were built under the guise of tractors, pilots trained in hidden airfields. The world watched, uneasy, as the once crippled nation rose again with terrifying speed. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone forbidden by the treaty. The move was a bold gamble, but the Allies did nothing. Hitler watched and learned. The world feared another war. He could do as he pleased. Soon after came the Rome-Berlin Axis, binding Germany to Mussolini's fascist Italy, and later, the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan. The old alliances of Europe crumbled as new ones, forged in steel and ideology, took their place. At home, the propaganda machine turned every success into myth. The economy appeared to recover, unemployment dropped, and pride returned. Children joined the Hitler Youth, learning loyalty before they learned love. The swastika flew above schools, churches, and stadiums. For the first time in years, Germany felt united, but it was a unity built on fear. As 1939 approached, the storm clouds gathered once again. In Austria, the German army marched unopposed. The Anschluss, the union of the two Germanic states, celebrated with roaring crowds. Then came the Sudetenland, torn from Czechoslovakia under the guise of protecting German minorities. Each conquest emboldened Hitler, each success convincing him that fate itself was on his side. But the world's patience was nearly gone. One last demand, Poland, would shatter what peace remained. In the darkness of his bunker-like office, surrounded by maps and generals, Hitler stared at Europe not as a continent, but as a stage awaiting his final performance. The night had fallen, but the storm was still to come. The world awoke to thunder on September 1st, 1939. At dawn, the skies over Poland filled with the roar of German aircraft, and the ground trembled as tanks rolled across the border. Villages vanished under bombs, and columns of refugees fled along dirt roads as the once peaceful fields turned to fire. The invasion was swift and merciless, the first test of a terrifying new style of warfare. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Speed, shock, and surprise were its weapons. Within weeks, Poland was crushed, its defenses torn apart by a machine that seemed unstoppable. Just 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The world had stepped once again into the abyss. But the German people cheered. Hitler had promised them greatness, and now it seemed to have arrived. Propaganda films showed endless parades of victorious soldiers, while speeches thundered that destiny itself was unfolding. Yet beneath the triumph lay the machinery of terror, the Gestapo, the secret police, tightening their grip on every street, every home. In the East, under a secret pact with Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the other side. The country was split in two, devoured by monsters. Millions were displaced, executed, or deported. It was the first act in a tragedy that would consume the world. By the spring of 1940, the storm had moved west. The Wehrmacht swept through Denmark and Norway, securing the North Sea. Then came the lightning strike through Belgium and the Low Countries, bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line. The French army, proud and confident, collapsed under the sheer speed of the assault. In 6 short weeks, France, once the mightiest land power in Europe, fell. German troops marched through Paris, their boots echoing against the cobblestones of the Champs-Élysées. The world watched in horror, and yet in awe. Europe lay at Hitler's feet. From the Atlantic coast to the Carpathian Mountains, the swastika flew over capitals and fortresses. Only Britain remained defiant, an island fortress standing alone against the storm. In the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe turned its fury toward the skies above London. Night after night, bombs rained down in the Blitz, reducing streets to rubble and painting the horizon in flame. Children slept in underground stations, mothers waited in silence, and searchlights crisscrossed the smoky sky like trembling fingers of hope. Hitler had expected Britain to fall quickly, but it did not. The courage of the Royal Air Force, fighting desperately against superior numbers, stopped the invasion before it began. Never in the field of human conflict, said Winston Churchill, was so much owed by so many to so few. The Führer's first failure had come not from an army, but from a wall of stubborn human will. And so, his gaze turned east. In June 1941, in the largest military operation in history, Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. 3 million German soldiers crossed the border at dawn, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The ground shook under endless convoys of tanks and trucks. The sky roared with dive bombers. The war had become something beyond human comprehension, vast, merciless, and driven by ideology. To Hitler, it was more than a war of conquest. It was a war of annihilation. He spoke of Lebensraum, living space for the German people, and saw the Slavic populations of the East as expendable. Villages were burned, prisoners executed, and entire regions left in ashes. The Einsatzgruppen, special killing squads, followed the army's advance, leaving behind mass graves that even the soldiers whispered about in fear. At first, victory seemed certain. The Red Army collapsed, hundreds of thousands captured, millions killed or scattered. By autumn, the Wehrmacht stood at the gates of Moscow. But then came the Russian winter, a silent, merciless ally. The temperature plunged below freezing, tanks froze in place, and soldiers wrapped themselves in rags. For the first time, the unstoppable machine began to falter. Meanwhile, far to the south, in the deserts of North Africa, German forces under Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, battled the British in swirling sands. The war had spread across continents, its front lines stretching from the Arctic to the Sahara. But the true horror was only beginning to reveal itself. Behind the front lines, trains began to move. Long, endless trains carrying human cargo toward camps hidden deep in the forests and plains of Europe. The Nazi dream of empire was no longer just about conquest. It was about extermination. The world had been set ablaze. Cities fell, nations vanished, and millions marched toward an unknown fate. And yet, Amid the chaos, in the corridors of Berlin and the frozen steppes of Russia, Hitler believed his triumph was inevitable. He was wrong. The fire he had unleashed would soon turn back upon him and consume everything he had built. The war had already drowned continents in blood, but what unfolded next was not a battle. It was something darker, something cold and deliberate. Behind the front lines, beyond the fields and cities conquered by the Reich, a new kind of war was being waged, one not fought with tanks or bullets, but with trains, barbed wire, and ash. It was called the Final Solution, and its aim was nothing less than the destruction of an entire people. At first, it was whispers, scattered reports of mass shootings in the east, villages burned with their inhabitants inside, and long lines of civilians herded away under the watch of armed men. The Einsatzgruppen, special SS death squads, followed the German army wherever it advanced. Their orders were simple: eliminate anyone deemed an enemy of the Reich. Jews, Roma, communists, priests, and anyone who dared to speak against the regime were lined up in fields and forests, gunned down by the thousands. By the end of 1941, over 1 million people had been murdered in this way, often face to face, bullet by bullet, in what witnesses later described as a mechanical slaughter of the soul. But for Hitler and his high command, this was not enough. The killings were too slow, too inefficient. In January 1942, in a quiet villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee near Berlin, 15 men met for what seemed like an ordinary administrative meeting. They drank wine, exchanged pleasantries, and discussed logistics, trains, food rations, and transport routes. Yet the subject of their meeting was the fate of millions. This was the Wannsee Conference, where the Nazi leadership formalized the plan for the final solution to the Jewish question. The decision was made to move from shooting to industrialized murder. From that moment, the machinery of death began to take shape with chilling precision. Camps that once held prisoners of war or political enemies were expanded, rebuilt, and repurposed. New ones were constructed from the ground up, designed not for labor, but for annihilation. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek became the dark heart of this system. Each was a world unto itself, ruled by cruelty and silence. Trains began to roll across Europe, from Paris, Amsterdam, Prague, Vienna, Warsaw, filled not with soldiers, but with families. Men, women, and children packed into cattle cars with no windows, no food, and no water. For days they traveled in darkness, pressed together so tightly they could not move. Many died before they ever saw the camps. Those who survived the journey arrived at gates marked with words like Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, a lie so cruel it seemed almost designed to mock them. Upon arrival, they were met by guards, barking dogs, and officers in black uniforms. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though no one yet understood why. Families were torn apart in an instant, men to one side, women and children to the other. A doctor would glance at them briefly and point left or right. To the left meant life, a few weeks, perhaps months, of forced labor. To the right meant death. Within hours, those sent right were led into buildings disguised as showers. Inside, the doors were sealed, and pellets of Zyklon B were dropped through openings in the roof. Within minutes, silence fell. When the doors reopened, men with shaven heads and blank faces, prisoners forced into labor, removed the bodies and piled them for cremation. Smoke rose from the chimneys day and night, carrying the ashes of millions into the indifferent sky. And still, the trains kept coming. The Holocaust was not only a story of monstrous cruelty, it was a story of complicity. Bureaucrats filed papers, engineers built chambers, doctors conducted experiments, neighbors looked away. It was evil disguised as order, genocide executed with the efficiency of an office routine. In German towns, people smelled the burning from distant camps, yet convinced themselves it was something else. They told themselves they did not know. By 1943, the tide of war was beginning to turn, but the killings did not stop. Even as the Wehrmacht faltered on the Eastern Front and cities burned under Allied bombs, the SS continued their grim work. Entire ghettos, like the one in Warsaw, were liquidated, their inhabitants sent to their deaths. In April of that year, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising erupted, a desperate act of defiance by those who knew they would die, but refused to go quietly. For nearly a month, starving fighters armed with stolen pistols held off the German army. The ghetto burned, but the echo of their resistance carried beyond the flames. Elsewhere, small acts of humanity flickered like candles in the dark. Families hid Jewish neighbors in cellars and attics. Priests forged baptism papers. Diplomats issued false visas. These acts did not stop the tide, but they reminded the world that even in hell, conscience survived. By late 1944, as the Red Army pushed west and Allied troops liberated France, the Nazis tried to erase the evidence of their crimes. Camps were dismantled, files burned, prisoners forced on death marches across frozen roads. But the truth could not be hidden. When Soviet soldiers entered Auschwitz in January 1945, they found mountains of shoes, glasses, and hair, the remnants of lives erased. The machinery of death had been stopped, but its shadow would never fade. 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, Poles, Russians, Roma, the disabled, and dissidents, had been murdered. The world would forever carry their absence. And yet, at that moment, the man who had unleashed this horror still ruled in Berlin, even as his empire crumbled around him. But not for long. The walls of the Reich were beginning to shake, and the vengeance of the world was coming for him. By 1944, the great empire that had once seemed invincible was crumbling from within. The skies over Germany burned nightly as Allied bombers turned city after city into smoldering ruins. The proud industrial heart of the Reich, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, now lay in ashes. The once confident citizens of the thousand-year Reich huddled in bunkers, clutching one another as the world they'd been promised collapsed above their heads. For the first time in years, fear returned to German soil, not from foreign enemies, but from the heavens themselves. Hitler's armies were in retreat on every front. In the east, the Red Army had risen from the ashes of its early defeats, rolling westward with unstoppable fury. Every town, every field they reclaimed carried the memory of atrocities committed by the Nazis, and the Soviet soldiers advanced with vengeance in their hearts. To the west, the Allies had landed in Normandy in June 1944, breaking through Hitler's Atlantic Wall and opening a second front. Paris was liberated by August. The Reich was being squeezed from both sides, its vast empire shrinking like a noose tightening around Berlin. Inside the Führer's headquarters, deep in the forests of East Prussia, paranoia ruled. Hitler, once the master of Europe, now ranted to empty rooms and trembling generals. His health was failing, his hand trembling uncontrollably, but his delusion remained unbroken. He ordered counterattacks that no longer made sense, sending boys and old men to die for imaginary victories. The Volkssturm, a people's army of the desperate, was raised, children of 16 standing shoulder to shoulder with veterans from the First World War, clutching rusty rifles and dreams of lost glory. Then came the July 20th plot, a spark of courage from within his own ranks. Officers led by Claus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb beneath the table in Hitler's briefing room, hoping to end the madness once and for all. The explosion ripped through the bunker, killing and maiming several officers, but Hitler survived with minor injuries. In his mind, it was proof of divine protection. The response was swift and brutal. Thousands arrested, many executed, including Stauffenberg, who faced the firing squad with the words, "Long live sacred Germany." The attempt had failed, and the Führer's paranoia only deepened. As winter fell, the last act began. In December 1944, Hitler launched a desperate offensive through the Ardennes forest, hoping to split the Allied lines and capture Antwerp. It was the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's final gamble. For a moment, it seemed to work. American troops were pushed back under heavy snow and fog. But the counterattack soon stalled, its fuel exhausted, its soldiers frozen and hungry. By January 1945, the Germans were in full retreat. The end was no longer a distant fear, it was a certainty. In the east, the Soviet juggernaut advanced relentlessly. City after city fell: Warsaw, Budapest, Königsberg. Refugees flooded westward, clogging the roads with carts, animals, and broken dreams. The Red Army reached the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. The once proud capital of the Reich was now surrounded, its streets lined with rubble and craters. The air stank of smoke, gasoline, and despair. By April 1945, Berlin had become a battlefield. Soviet artillery thundered day and night, shaking the city to its foundations. Civilians hid in basements as shells shattered their homes. Hitler had retreated to his underground Führer bunker, a concrete labyrinth beneath the chancellery. There, surrounded by loyal aides, generals, and his new wife Eva Braun, he lived in a twilight world of delusion. Maps on the walls showed armies that no longer existed. He raged against his commanders, blaming everyone but himself. His voice, once hypnotic, now cracked with madness. Above ground, the world he'd built was collapsing in flame. German soldiers, boys barely old enough to shave, fought street by street, house by house. Women carried ammunition, old men manned machine guns, and the once proud Wehrmacht dissolved into chaos. The Soviet flags crept ever closer, their red stars glinting in the fires of Berlin. On April 30th, 1945, with the Red Army only a few hundred meters away, Adolf Hitler made his final decision. In his dimly lit bunker, he dictated his last will, blaming the Jews for the war and declaring that his people had failed him. Then, with Eva Braun by his side, he ended his life. The echo of that gunshot marked the death of the Third Reich. His body was carried outside, doused in gasoline, and burned in the courtyard as Soviet shells rained around them. The news spread through the bunker like a ghostly wind. Some wept, others simply stared in silence. Above, the fighting continued for 2 more days. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. A week later, Germany signed an unconditional surrender to the Allies. The war in Europe was over. The nightmare had ended, but the cost was almost beyond comprehension. More than 70 million lives lost across continents, entire cities erased, families gone forever. Germany lay in ruins, its people haunted by the crimes committed in their name. And yet, amid the ashes, something fragile began to stir. A question, whispered at first, then spoken aloud. How could it happen? The fire had burned itself out, but the smoke would linger for generations. When the guns finally fell silent, Europe exhaled for the first time in 6 long years, but the air it breathed was thick with smoke, grief, and disbelief. Germany was a graveyard of cities. Its once proud streets were now nothing more than piles of brick and twisted metal. The rivers ran gray with ash, the forests scarred by fire, and from the air, the land looked wounded, like a body torn apart and left to rot beneath a clouded sky. Millions wandered aimlessly through the ruins, refugees, orphans, survivors. They searched for homes that no longer existed, for families that had vanished, for answers that would never come. The victors, the Allies, moved swiftly to divide and occupy what was left of the Reich. The country was split into 4 zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Each controlled a piece of what had once been Hitler's empire. Berlin, though ruined, became the symbol of this fractured piece, itself divided into 4 sectors like a heart sliced open. The city was silent, but not still. Out of its ruins rose questions that no nation had ever faced before. What do you do with a people who followed a madman? How do you rebuild a nation that had destroyed the world? And how do you deliver justice when the crimes defy imagination? The answers began to take shape in a courtroom. In November 1945, in the city of Nuremberg, once the site of Hitler's grand rallies, the first international war crimes tribunal in history began. The irony was deliberate. The same hall that had echoed with the shouts of Sieg Heil now held the quiet murmur of lawyers and translators, the scratch of pens, the clicking of cameras. For the first time, the leaders of a nation were being held accountable not just for losing a war, but for waging one unjustly, for genocide, for crimes against humanity, for the deliberate murder of millions. 24 of the most powerful men of the Nazi regime sat in the dock, flanked by guards, beneath the flags of the Allied powers. Hermann Göring, the swaggering commander of the Luftwaffe, tried to appear defiant. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, sat silent, staring into nothing. Others wept, prayed, or refused to speak. But the evidence was beyond denial. Films of the concentration camps were shown, skeletal figures, piles of corpses, children with hollow eyes. Witnesses told their stories in trembling voices. Even hardened soldiers looked away. The words spoken in that courtroom would echo across generations. Crimes against humanity, genocide, aggression. These were new terms, created to name horrors that language had never needed before. The judges, from America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, listened as the Nazi ideology was dissected and exposed, its lies laid bare before the world. When the verdicts were read in October 1946, 12 men were sentenced to death. Others received prison terms. Some escaped justice through suicide. Göring swallowed poison the night before his hanging. But the message was clear. For the first time in history, no one was above the law. The age of impunity had ended. Outside the courtroom, however, the reality was far more complex. Germany was starving. Millions of civilians, including those who had never supported the regime, faced famine and disease. Cities like Dresden and Hamburg were unrecognizable. Families dug through rubble for food. The Allied powers began a slow process of denazification, removing former party members from positions of power, rewriting schoolbooks, and dismantling propaganda. Yet, for many Germans, shame and denial ran deep. Some refused to believe the extent of the crimes. Others simply tried to forget. The moral wounds were invisible, but they cut deeper than any bomb. Amid this despair, something unexpected began to take root, a quiet determination to start again. In the American and British zones, efforts to rebuild democracy began. New political parties were formed, newspapers reopened, and local governments emerged from the ruins. Meanwhile, in the East, under Soviet control, a different vision took shape, one of socialism, surveillance, and strict control. The seeds of a new division were being sown, one that would soon split not just Germany, but the entire world. Still, amid the ashes of destruction, the Nuremberg trials gave humanity something fragile yet profound, a sense of moral clarity. They reminded the world that even in the aftermath of unimaginable darkness, truth could still be spoken, and justice, however imperfect, could still be done. But justice, though necessary, could not erase memory. The ghosts of the camps, the ruins of Berlin, the silence of those who had vanished, they lingered. The war had ended, but its echoes stretched far into the future, shaping the course of a divided Europe and a world now entering the shadow of a new conflict, the Cold War. The fires of empire had gone out, but from the ashes, a new world, fragile, fearful, and uncertain, was being born. In the years that followed the war, Germany became a land of ghosts and crossroads, caught between the old world's ashes and the birth of a new one. The guns were silent, but the world had not found peace. The victors of the war had become rivals, and Germany, the nation that had once sought to rule the world, now stood as the battlefield for a different kind of war, one without open armies, but with invisible lines, whispered threats, and walls that would one day split families apart. The Allied occupation zones, created to manage post-war Germany, had begun as a symbol of cooperation. The Americans, British, French, and Soviets each controlled a quadrant, sharing the burden of rebuilding a broken nation. But cooperation soon dissolved into suspicion. In the West, the Americans and their allies pushed for recovery, democracy, and economic revival. In the East, the Soviets imposed control with iron discipline, reshaping society in their image. The alliance that had defeated Hitler was collapsing, and Germany, once again, was at the center of the storm. The Marshall Plan, announced by the United States in 1947, offered billions in aid to rebuild Europe, not just its cities, but its spirit. Western Germany benefited greatly. Factories roared back to life. Roads and railways were rebuilt, and food once again filled the markets. The people, weary from despair, began to feel hope stir for the first time in a decade. But the Soviet Union saw the plan as a weapon, not of war, but of influence. To Moscow, American aid meant American control, and Joseph Stalin would not allow it. In the Soviet zone, the economy was dismantled piece by piece. Factories were stripped, equipment shipped east as reparations. Land was confiscated, and a new socialist order began to rise from the ruins. Political dissent was crushed swiftly. Newspapers, radio stations, and schools were reshaped to reflect the Soviet ideology. The message was clear. While the West spoke of freedom, the East would march to the rhythm of the Red Army's drum. Berlin, though deep within Soviet territory, was divided just like the nation itself, for sectors within one broken city. It became the heart of the growing tension, a microcosm of the world's new divide. Here, American optimism and Soviet suspicion faced each other across a few narrow streets. The city that had once been the beating heart of the Third Reich was now the fragile front line of a cold, invisible conflict. Then, in 1948, the fragile peace shattered. The Western powers decided to merge their zones economically, forming a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, to stabilize trade and rebuild confidence. Overnight, the German people lined up at banks, trading their worthless wartime paper for the crisp blue bills of a new beginning. The Soviets saw this as a direct challenge. In retaliation, they cut off all road, rail, and canal routes into West Berlin. Food, fuel, and supplies for 2 million people were suddenly trapped behind enemy lines. The Berlin blockade had begun. It was a gamble. Stalin hoped the Allies would abandon the city, leaving it to the Soviets without a single shot fired. But the Americans and British refused to yield. Instead, they launched one of the most daring humanitarian operations in history, the Berlin Airlift. Day and night, Allied aircraft flew in and out of West Berlin, landing every few minutes, bringing tons of food, coal, and medicine. The skies above the city became lifelines of hope. Children ran to the fences of Tempelhof Airport, waving as pilots, nicknamed candy bombers, dropped small parachutes of sweets from their cockpits. For nearly a year, the airlift continued, through rain, snow, and exhaustion. More than 270,000 flights kept the city alive. And finally, on May 12, 1949, the Soviets lifted the blockade. The Western Allies had won, not through force, but through endurance. That same year, Germany was officially split in two. In May 1949, the Western zones united to form the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, West Germany, with Bonn as its temporary capital. A new constitution was written, built upon democracy, human rights, and the promise to never repeat the mistakes of the past. A former resistance figure, Konrad Adenauer, became the first chancellor, leading the country toward recovery and integration with the West. 5 months later, in October 1949, the Soviets responded by creating the German Democratic Republic, GDR, East Germany, with East Berlin as its capital. It was a state born not from the people's will, but from Soviet decree. The Socialist Unity Party, SED, took control, and under the watchful eye of the Stasi, East Germany became one of the most tightly controlled societies in the world. And so, from the ruins of the Reich, two Germanys emerged, one free, one bound. They shared a language, a history, and a sorrow, but were separated by walls of ideology. Families found themselves divided overnight. Brothers fought for different dreams. Children grew up under different flags. The Cold War had found its fault line, and it ran straight through the heart of Germany. The ruins had been rebuilt, but unity was gone, and in its place stood a wall of silence that would soon become very real. Berlin, a city once bursting with laughter, light, and history, had become a place of shadows and whispers. The war had ended years ago, but a new kind of conflict had settled over its cobblestone streets. Not one fought with tanks or bombs, but with fear, propaganda, and ideology. West Berlin glowed with neon lights, jazz music, and the hum of new life. East Berlin lingered in the grayness of Soviet control. Its people watched, its voices silenced. Two worlds existed side by side, divided not by geography, but by belief. In the 1950s, both Germanys began to define themselves. In the West, the Federal Republic of Germany under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer rose from ruin with astonishing speed. Factories reopened, exports boomed, and a spirit of optimism filled the air. It was called the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Cities once scarred by bombs were reborn with glass and steel. Roads filled with Volkswagen Beetles and Mercedes sedans. Families bought radios, refrigerators, and television sets. The German people, haunted by their past, poured their energy into building a better future, one brick, one invention, one song at a time. In the East, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, took a different path. Under Walter Ulbricht, and later with Moscow's blessing, the government built a socialist state rooted in discipline, equality, and control. The factories were nationalized, the land redistributed, and the state promised housing, education, and work for all. But behind that promise lay the Stasi, the most feared secret police in Europe. They listened, watched, and whispered. A neighbor could be an informer, a friend could be an agent. Trust became a luxury few could afford. While West Germany opened itself to the world, East Germany closed its borders. Yet one door remained open, Berlin. The divided city had become the escape route to freedom. Every day, hundreds of East Germans slipped across to the western sectors, sometimes with forged papers, sometimes under cover of night. Teachers, engineers, doctors, the best minds of the East, fled to the promise of liberty and opportunity. By 1961, nearly 3 million people had escaped. The East was bleeding, and Ulbricht knew something had to be done. Then came the summer of 1961. The air was heavy, electric with tension. Rumors spread through East Berlin like wildfire. Something was coming. Soviet tanks were seen near the border. Stretches of barbed wire began to appear overnight. Families hurried to cross one last time, clutching suitcases and children, their faces pale with fear. And then, on August 13, 1961, the world awoke to a nightmare made real. In the early hours, East German soldiers and workers, under orders from the Soviet-backed government, rolled out trucks, concrete blocks, and coils of wire. They began sealing the border, not to keep people out, but to keep them in. Streets were torn up, windows bricked shut, railway lines severed. The border that once divided ideology became a wall of stone and steel. The Berlin Wall had been born. Families awoke to find themselves on opposite sides, waving desperately across barbed wire fences. Lovers separated overnight, unable to reach each other. Workers who lived in the East and worked in the West found themselves trapped, staring helplessly at the city skyline they could no longer touch. Mothers screamed as children were held back by soldiers. Within hours, the world's most painful symbol of division had risen, cutting the heart of a nation in two. The wall stretched for more than 155 kilometers, surrounding West Berlin entirely. Guard towers loomed above, manned by soldiers with orders to shoot anyone who tried to cross. Floodlights burned through the night, illuminating what was called the Death Strip, a barren zone of sand, mines, and wire. Every step toward freedom carried the risk of death. And yet, people still tried. In the dead of night, desperate souls dug tunnels, floated across rivers on makeshift rafts, or leapt from apartment windows into the western zone. Some succeeded, vanishing into the streets of West Berlin to cheers and tears. Others fell beneath the wall, their blood staining the concrete that separated liberty from tyranny. The names of those who died became silent prayers whispered in secret homes. Meanwhile, in the West, the world watched in horror. American President John F. Kennedy condemned the construction, yet no tanks rolled to stop it. The wall, grim and gray, was here to stay. It stood not just as a barrier between East and West Berlin, but as the physical embodiment of the Cold War itself. Life on either side of the wall continued in parallel worlds. In West Berlin, music and art flourished, a city defiantly alive, surrounded but unbroken. In East Berlin, life was quieter, controlled, a rhythm dictated by the state. Dreams of freedom became whispers shared in underground clubs, in secret circles of artists and poets who painted, wrote, and sang for a world they might never see. The wall would stand for nearly 3 decades, a scar across the heart of a nation, a silent monument to fear and endurance. But though it stood tall, it could never silence the human spirit that longed for unity. And deep beneath that wall, in the souls of the people who lived in its shadow, a quiet hope began to grow. A hope that one day it would fall. For many, the Berlin Wall seemed eternal, a monstrous serpent of concrete cutting through the veins of a living city. But beneath its cold shadow, life continued. People adapted, as humans always do. Children in East Berlin grew up never knowing the world beyond it, their playgrounds watched by guards, their textbooks filled with promises of socialism's glory. In the West, freedom flourished, yet guilt lingered, a constant awareness that only a few streets away, others lived behind invisible chains. The 1960s dawned, and with it came a generation that refused to stay silent. Across the world, young people were questioning the rules of their parents, and Germany was no exception. In West Germany, universities became cauldrons of rebellion. Students rallied against the lingering shadows of Nazism, the silence of their elders, and the militarism of the Cold War. They demanded truth, transparency, and peace. Posters of Marx and Che Guevara hung beside guitars and protest slogans. The once quiet post-war youth now sang with fire in their voices. In the East, rebellion took a quieter form. Every book read in secret, every Western song played on a smuggled radio, was an act of defiance. The Stasi watched, listened, and recorded 1,000,000 files on 1,000,000 citizens, but even their surveillance couldn't crush the yearning for something more. A new generation had been born into a divided world, but their dreams were too big to be contained by walls or borders. The arts became the safest language of rebellion. In smoky East Berlin cellars, young painters and poets created worlds that spoke of loss and longing without ever naming the wall. Songs whispered of missing skies and unseen roads. Censors tried to silence them, but the melodies lingered. Even within control, beauty found cracks to grow through. Meanwhile, West Germany was transforming. The economic miracle had given birth to prosperity, but also to complacency. By the late 1960s, protests erupted in cities like Frankfurt and Berlin as students accused their government of moral hypocrisy, preaching democracy while tolerating former Nazis in office. In 1967, a protest turned deadly when a student, Benno Ohnesorg, was shot by police. His death ignited a wave of outrage, and the country's youth took to the streets demanding change. Out of this unrest grew new political voices, movements that would one day evolve into the Green Party, into labor reforms, into the social conscience that would redefine Germany. The wounds of the past were being reopened, not to hurt, but to heal. Across the wall, in the East, the government doubled down. Propaganda painted the West as corrupt and decadent. Citizens were told that they lived in a worker's paradise, free from capitalist greed. But reality told a different story. Factories were inefficient, shortages were constant, and the air was heavy with suspicion. If a man received a phone call from a friend abroad, the Stasi might visit the next morning. If a woman wrote a letter too boldly, she might lose her job or her home. Fear was a quiet roommate in every East German household. And yet, hope persisted. It flickered in the form of underground churches, where pastors spoke softly of truth and unity. It lived in the secret tunnels still dug beneath the wall, though most were discovered before completion. It breathed through the West German television signals that East Berliners caught late at night, their screens glowing faintly with images of a freer world. Families would huddle together in silence, curtains drawn, listening to the laughter of talk shows, the music of the Beatles, the hum of a world they could not touch. By the 1970s, the cracks in the wall were not visible, but they had begun to form. Chancellor Willy Brandt of West Germany understood this. His policy of Ostpolitik, or Eastern policy, sought not confrontation, but reconciliation. He extended a hand to the East, believing that small steps, trade, diplomacy, human contact, could melt the ice of division. In 1970, Brandt visited Warsaw and knelt at the monument to the victims of the Nazi ghetto. The image of a German chancellor kneeling in apology before the world became a moment of quiet revolution. It was a gesture that said, "We remember. We repent. We will do better." That same spirit began to ripple through Germany. Families were allowed limited visits across the border. Letters passed through slowly, carefully censored, but carrying love nonetheless. The East loosened its grip slightly, allowing cultural exchanges, music festivals, and art exhibitions. Each meeting, each handshake, each song shared across the divide was a tiny rebellion against the silence. Still, the wall stood, strong, brutal, and unyielding. It was guarded by thousands, and its death strip claimed hundreds of lives. But walls, no matter how thick, cannot contain time or truth. Beneath the gray concrete, the seeds of change had been planted. They would take decades to grow, watered by whispers, courage, and longing. And one day, those seeds would burst through the stone. But for now, the people waited for a sign, a moment, a miracle. The world beyond the wall continued to change. And though the watchtowers still stood, the eyes behind them were growing tired. Something was stirring in the east, something that even the Stasi could not stop. By the time the 1970s turned to the 1980s, the wall had stood for 2 decades. It was weathered now, streaked with rain, covered in graffiti on the western side, and sterile gray on the eastern. It loomed not only as a physical barrier, but as a psychological one, casting a long shadow over generations who had never known a unified Germany. Yet, in that shadow, something extraordinary was beginning to stir. The silence of fear was breaking, not with guns, but with music, whispers, and courage. In East Germany, the government's grip remained tight, but the people's patience was unraveling. The promise of a workers' paradise had soured into a gray monotony of shortages, censorship, and suspicion. The Stasi, the all-seeing secret police, continued to spy on its citizens with an obsession bordering on madness. They tapped phones, opened mail, and filled filing cabinets with the private lives of millions. To be seen talking to a Westerner, or even showing too much curiosity, could ruin your life. Yet, despite the fear, dissent was growing, quietly, like roots beneath the concrete. Young people, tired of propaganda, began to seek freedom through art and underground music. Punk bands, defiant and raw, emerged in the backstreets of East Berlin, their songs coated with rebellion. Their lyrics spoke of walls, dreams, and faceless rulers, metaphors that everyone understood but dared not speak aloud. The authorities tried to suppress them, arresting musicians and banning performances. But every time they silenced one voice, 3 more rose to take its place. Music became the pulse of protest, echoing through basements, garages, and secret gatherings. Meanwhile, in West Germany, the youth lived a different rhythm, one of freedom, prosperity, and self-discovery. The 1970s and 80s brought waves of cultural transformation, feminism, environmentalism, pacifism. German rock and pop bands sang about peace, identity, and unity. Artists and filmmakers challenged the ghosts of the past while imagining a shared future. Though separated by walls and politics, the dreams of both Germanys began to rhyme. Even religion, once silenced, found its voice again. Churches in East Germany became safe havens for free thought and discussion. Beneath the flicker of candlelight, pastors and parishioners gathered not just to pray, but to talk about peace, justice, and human rights. What began as small circles of faith grew into the peace movement, quietly spreading across towns like Leipzig and Dresden. The message was simple yet powerful: we will not fight with weapons. We will fight with truth. The government could imprison dissidents, but it couldn't imprison ideas. Figures like Robert Havemann, a chemist and philosopher, and Wolf Biermann, a poet and singer-songwriter, became the voices of defiance. Biermann's songs, bold, witty, and heartbreakingly honest, were banned in the East. When the regime revoked his citizenship in 1976 while he was performing in the West, outrage rippled through East Germany. Even loyal party members began to question the morality of a state that exiled its artists for telling the truth. The 1980s arrived with economic stagnation and crumbling faith in the socialist system. Across Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union's influence was waning. The rise of Mikhail Gorbachev and his policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, sent shockwaves through the communist world. Gorbachev spoke of transparency, reform, and a new beginning, words that East German leaders feared. For if their citizens heard such talk, they might demand the same. And demand they did. In the factories, whispers turned to conversations. In churches, prayers turned to protests. Across East Germany, citizens began organizing peace marches, holding candles, and singing hymns of hope. The government dismissed them as small gatherings, but each one grew larger. The chants were not of war, but of freedom. Their power lay in their peace. Meanwhile, Western music and culture continued to seep through the cracks of the wall. Smuggled tapes of David Bowie, Pink Floyd, and the Rolling Stones circulated in secret. Bowie's 1977 performance near the Berlin Wall was legendary. Thousands of East Berliners crowded along the other side, listening from the darkness. When he sang Heroes, a song inspired by lovers divided by the wall, the sound carried across the border like a promise. For one fleeting moment, the wall trembled not from explosions, but from music. And it wasn't just music. Western television signals, though officially banned, reached deep into the East. Families would huddle in front of flickering screens, adjusting antennas to catch glimpses of the world beyond, colorful, loud, and free. Advertisements for jeans and soda became symbols of another life. For young East Germans, it was as if another universe existed just a few kilometers away, a universe they could see but never touch. The tension grew unbearable. The state was losing its hold, not through force, but through imagination. Once the people had seen what was possible, once they believed that life could be more than surveillance and obedience, control was doomed to fail. By the mid-1980s, East Germany stood at a crossroads. Its government, led by Erich Honecker, clung desperately to the old ways, even as the world changed around them. But beneath the surface, the spirit of the people was changing too. The fear that had once paralyzed them was beginning to fade, replaced by something stronger. It was not anger. It was not hatred. It was hope. The wall still stood tall, gray, unyielding, and armed. But for the first time, it seemed to waver. Because now, the people were no longer afraid to imagine its fall. And once imagination turns into belief, belief becomes destiny. The cracks in the concrete were no longer hidden. They were spreading. The final act was approaching. It began quietly, not with a bang, but with a whisper. A press conference, a misunderstanding, and a weary spokesman reading from a note he barely understood. It was November 9th, 1989, an ordinary Thursday evening in East Berlin, and the air was cold enough to turn breath into smoke. No one knew that before the night was over, the most impenetrable barrier in Europe would crumble, not by bombs or armies, but by the will of a people who had finally decided they would wait no longer. For months, East Germany had been unraveling. The protests that began as candlelight vigils in Leipzig had grown into rivers of people, tens of thousands marching every Monday, chanting, "Wir sind das Volk." We are the people. They carried candles, not weapons, songs, not slogans of violence. Each step was an act of defiance against a government that had ruled with fear for 40 years. And as the movement spread, something extraordinary happened. The police began to hesitate. The soldiers, once feared, lowered their guns. The tide had turned. By the fall of 1989, the impossible was becoming reality. Communist regimes across Eastern Europe were collapsing. In Poland, elections brought solidarity to power. In Hungary, the border to Austria had opened, allowing East Germans to flee westward through fields and forests. Trains filled with families, children, and dreams rolled toward freedom. The East German government tried to stop them, but the flood could not be contained. The wall that had once been their greatest symbol of control had become their greatest symbol of failure. That evening, Gunter Schabowski, a nervous party official, faced a room of journalists. He shuffled his papers, reading the latest announcement from the Politburo. A new travel law had been approved. East Germans would now be allowed to apply for visas to visit the West. But when asked when it would take effect, Schabowski fumbled. Confused, he looked at his notes, then muttered words that would change history. "As far as I know, it takes effect immediately." Without delay, the words spread like wildfire. Within minutes, West Berlin radio stations were broadcasting. The border is open. People in East Berlin, sitting at dinner tables and glued to their televisions, froze. Could it be true? Was it finally happening? Some laughed in disbelief. Others wept. Then, without waiting for confirmation, they grabbed their coats and walked, some even ran, toward the checkpoints. At first, the border guards didn't believe it either. At the Bornholmer Strasse crossing, hundreds gathered, shouting, crying, pleading to be let through. The guards had received no orders, no instructions. Their superiors were silent, unreachable. The crowd swelled to thousands, pressing forward, chanting, "Open the gate." It was chaos, but it was peaceful chaos. No one wanted violence. They just wanted to cross. Then, sometime before midnight, one border commander, Harold Jaeger, made a decision that would echo through history. Unable to withstand the pressure, unwilling to fire on his own people, he gave the order. Open the barrier. And with that, 40 years of division ended. A roar erupted, not of anger, but of pure, unfiltered joy. People surged across the border, laughing, crying, embracing strangers. West Berliners rushed to meet them, handing out champagne, flowers, and tears. The sound of cheering filled the air, mingling with music and the rhythmic pounding of hammers as the first pieces of the wall were broken off. Children climbed atop the concrete, waving flags. Lovers kissed on the wall's edge. Soldiers stood in disbelief as people danced on what had been, only hours earlier, a death strip. Television cameras broadcast the images around the world, the gray wall now alive with color, light, and freedom. David Hasselhoff's "Looking for Freedom" blared through the speakers of cars honking in celebration. Strangers hugged in the streets of both Berlins, united by laughter and disbelief. Many had waited their entire lives for this night. Some had never dared to dream it would come. For the first time since 1961, families were reunited. Mothers clutched sons they hadn't seen in decades. Friends met as if time itself had stopped. The border checkpoints, once symbols of fear, became gateways to joy. It was as if the entire city exhaled, a collective sigh that carried across the world. Leaders and diplomats scrambled to understand what had happened, but the truth was simple. The people had done it themselves. No treaty, no army, no negotiation. Just ordinary men and women who refused to be divided any longer. All night, the celebrations continued. The sky above Berlin glowed with lights, fireworks, and the reflection of something greater, human freedom rediscovered. Reporters called it the end of an era, but for the people of Germany, it felt more like a beginning. By morning, as the sun rose over the city, the gray concrete of the Berlin Wall stood scarred with holes and covered in color, graffiti reading, Freiheit, Danke, and wir sind ein Volk. Freedom, thank you. And we are one people. And for the first time in nearly half a century, they truly were. The morning after the wall fell, Berlin awoke to a world forever changed. The streets were littered with champagne bottles, flowers, and fragments of gray concrete. Pieces of history that people now clutched like treasure. The sound of laughter echoed through the city that had once been split by silence. Strangers embraced in the streets, tears blending with joy. The wall, that cold, unyielding line of fear, was no more. In its place stood hope, raw and trembling, but alive. Yet as the celebrations faded into dawn, a daunting question emerged. What now? The fall of the wall had not been planned by politicians or generals. It had been an act of the people, spontaneous, unstoppable, emotional. But now, the governments of East and West Germany had to face the immense task of becoming one nation again. For 40 years, two different systems had shaped two different worlds, one capitalist and democratic, the other socialist and controlled. Even their clocks ticked differently, not in time, but in rhythm. Reuniting them would be no simple task. In the West, Chancellor Helmut Kohl watched history unfold with a mixture of awe and urgency. He moved swiftly, recognizing that this was a moment that could not be allowed to slip away. In late 1989, he proposed a 10-point plan, a roadmap for reunification that began with cooperation and ended with full unity. At first, even his allies thought it too ambitious. But momentum was on his side. Across both Germanies, the cry was growing louder. Wir sind ein Volk. We are one people. In East Germany, the communist government collapsed in slow motion. The once feared Stasi was dismantled, its offices stormed by citizens who discovered millions of secret files documenting their lives. People stood in shock as they read the words, betrayals by friends, neighbors, even family members. The truth was painful, but it was cleansing. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The first free elections in East Germany were held in March 1990. For the first time in its history, the people could vote without fear. The results were clear. The majority wanted reunification with the West, and they wanted it fast. The East German reformers, once heroes of the protests, now found themselves overtaken by the tide of unity. The German mark, symbol of Western stability, became the new currency, replacing the nearly worthless East German money. Overnight, shops were filled with goods once seen only in Western magazines. The smell of fresh coffee, chocolate, and new clothes filled the air, small symbols of a long-denied normalcy. On October 3, 1990, under the black, red, and gold flag of a new beginning, Germany was officially reunified. The world watched as fireworks lit the sky and choirs sang, Einigkeit und Recht und Freiheit, unity, justice, and freedom. After nearly half a century of division, the German people stood as one again. The celebrations were grand, but the weight of history hung heavy. The task ahead was monumental.